Jon Snow stood in the frosty courtyard of Castle Black with a sense of dread coiled in his chest. The clang of steel from distant training sessions reverberated off the ancient stones, but he could scarcely focus on it. Overhead, the pale sky bore the haze of a sun that would never truly warm the northern reaches. Across from him, Stannis Baratheon surveyed him with a keen gaze, jaw set in the stern line of a soldier king who had little patience for indecision. The crisp wind tugged at Stannis's heavy cloak. Melisandre stood near the king, her fiery hair like a brand against the north's perpetual gloom, and Davos Seaworth was at Stannis's side, silent but watchful. The offer had been laid out. In front of all these witnesses, it hung in the frigid air, intangible yet formidable. Jon Snow, if he but bent the knee to Stannis Baratheon, would be given legitimacy as Jon Stark and named Lord of Winterfell, the seat of the ancient kings of winter. It was an offer that threatened to tear him in two. For so long, Jon's life had been bounded by the walls of his bastard identity. A son of Ned Stark, but never a Stark himself. He had taken vows to the Night's Watch, sworn to hold no lands, father no children, and remain loyal until death. Yet everything else in him, every bit of longing and desire to protect his home, tugged him toward accepting. He thought of Robb, who had marched to war and left Winterfell vulnerable, and how that seat of the Starks was now in the hands of traitors. He thought of Bran and Rickon, lost or fled. Sansa, a captive somewhere he could not reach. Arya, vanished. The last he'd heard, Theon Greyjoy had claimed he'd killed both Bran and Rickon, but those rumors stood on shaky ground. He prayed they were false. He prayed the boys might still roam the world, though he knew how often hope might be dashed. Here Stannis Baratheon stood, offering him a chance to reclaim the seat of his father, to rally the North and to drive out the Boltons. It was not a small thing. "I ask you to bend the knee," Stannis said again, his voice hard as the ice underfoot. "Acknowledge me as your king, and I will name you Lord of Winterfell. Jon Stark." The emphasis on that last name was not unintentional. Jon felt the eyes of the men of the Night's Watch upon him. He stood in his black cloak, the fading sun's light catching the edges of the crow-feathered lining. His breath curled in the cold. He opened his mouth, half expecting the refusal that had been on his tongue from the moment Stannis arrived. Yet he heard another voice echo in his mind. "If you do not protect the North, who will?" The vow to the Night's Watch was dear to him, but so was Winterfell, so was the North. The Boltons held the seat now, and word from the south was that Ramsay Snow, a base-born son of Roose Bolton, was committing atrocities. The memory of the Red Wedding still curdled his blood. Was it not part of his duty, as a son of Ned Stark in all but name, to reclaim what had been lost? 4 years, the Night's Watch had done little but wither. Their numbers shrank, their influence among the kingdoms dwindled, and now, with wildlings pouring over the Frostfangs and the White Walkers stirring beyond the wall, the realm itself stood on a precipice. Jon had long worried about how best to defend the realms of men. Winter was coming in a way few truly understood. Maybe if he had the strength of the North behind him, maybe if he were recognized as Lord of Winterfell, he could warn them, he could unify them against the true threat. The Watch had always looked north, but what if the North needed a lord who cared more for its survival than for southern games? The chill stung his cheeks. The murmur of onlookers subsided as the tension in the courtyard soared. The Red Woman's eyes burned into him, a flicker of satisfaction or interest in their depths, though Jon found he could not hold her gaze for long. He glanced at Davos Seaworth and saw the man's expression was a mixture of sympathy and concern, as if Davos was aware of what a crossroads Jon faced, and perhaps he too understood the cost. Samwell Tarly, Jon's friend, hovered at the edge of the training yard, wringing his hands as if wanting to speak up, but speechless. Jon drew a breath, let it out and said, "I will accept." It felt as if even the wind stilled for a moment. Some black brothers exchanged startled glances. Others stared at Jon as though he had spoken an unthinkable blasphemy. He had sworn an oath, taken the black, and it was no small matter to break faith with the Night's Watch. For all the years of his youth, Jon had believed he was meant to remain in their ranks until his dying day. But that day a different choice was made. The pit that opened in his belly frightened him more than he cared to admit. Yet he continued, "For the good of the North, I will accept your offer. If it means driving the Boltons from Winterfell and uniting the North to face the true threat beyond the wall, I will bend the knee." Stannis' lips pressed into a firm line. He nodded once, a short jerk of approval. "Kneel, then." Jon took a step forward, sank to a knee on the cold ground. The memory of Robb being proclaimed king in the North flashed through Jon's mind, though the circumstances now were so different. This was not a cry of northern lords, but an anointing by a king who claimed the Iron Throne. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath as Jon bowed his head. "I, Stannis of the House Baratheon, first of my name, King of the Undulls and the First Men, do hereby name you Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, so long as you are loyal and do your duty." A ripple of tension slithered across the faces of the Night's Watch, but no one moved. Some might have wondered if Jon's vow to the Watch was null the moment he accepted. The king continued, "Rise, Lord Stark." Jon stood, feeling the unnatural weight of a name he had never worn. He saw tears shining in Sam's eyes, though for what reason, pride or sorrow, he could not tell. Even from where he stood, Jon could sense the swirl of disappointment and betrayal from certain black brothers who remained loyal to the old ways. He wondered if some of them might see him as an oathbreaker, no better than those who deserted the Watch for fear or gold. It didn't matter. This choice was made for better or worse. He was Jon Stark now, recognized, a lord sworn to Stannis Baratheon, and he would have to live with that. Stannis did not linger. With a curt word, he commanded his small retinue to prepare for departure. His goal was clear: to march south, gather the strength of northern houses still loyal to the cause, and deal with the Bolton threat at Winterfell. The plan had been to gain the support of the wildlings as well, though that negotiation had only partially succeeded. Tormund Giantsbane had led his people through the tunnel at the wall thanks to Jon's efforts, but that had been done under Jon's old vow, not under the newly forged oath to Stannis. The wildlings, free folk to the bone, might not so readily fall in line with a man now crowned with a southern lordship. Jon prayed they would see sense in the alliance, for the White Walkers spared no one. He retreated to his small chamber. Ghost, his albino direwolf, awaited him. Jon sank onto the edge of the bed, resting his head in his hands while Ghost pressed a cold nose against his knee. The weight of the moment nearly crushed him. He was no longer of the Night's Watch. He had chosen a path that would cause many to brand him an oathbreaker, possibly unworthy of trust or respect. But perhaps the vow he kept in his heart, to protect the realm, was bigger than the vow he had abandoned. The Starks had always sought to shield the North from the evils of the world. Jon only hoped he did not invite an evil greater still. The next day, in a chamber still redolent of old wood smoke, Jon faced the Lord Commander's table for the final time. Acting Lord Commander Bowen Marsh stood rigid, face pale with dismay. The old steward's eyes were full of betrayal. "You've abandoned your vows, Snow," he said, using Jon's old name with evident scorn. "If you walk out of here now, you walk out an oathbreaker. There's no place for you in the Night's Watch, not even in the next life." He spat the words, though perhaps it was heartbreak fueling his fury. The men had lost a popular figure, one that many had believed might become their next Lord Commander. Jon stood tall. He wore his black cloak for the last time, though it felt heavier than mail. "I have not abandoned the realm. The threat beyond the wall hasn't vanished." He kept his voice measured, containing the swirl of emotion within. "But I can do more for the Night's Watch from beyond its walls. The Boltons have Winterfell. We all know the crimes they've committed, and we know they won't lend an ear to the warnings that must be spread throughout the land. Stannis Baratheon promises me soldiers, resources, ways to hold the North, to rally it in time for the threat we all know is coming." Marsh's lips thinned. "We are the Watchers on the Wall," he said, reciting the old words. "We keep our vow no matter the cost. That is what sets us apart from every petty warlord in the realm." His tone softened momentarily, with something akin to regret. "But you have made your choice, Snow. May the gods help us all." Jon wanted to plead with them, to explain that he was not deserting them in spirit, but that would make no difference to men who saw only black and white. So he gave them a final, solemn nod, unfastened the clasp of his black cloak, and placed it on the table. The watchers on the wall would remain as they ever had. Jon Stark, how strange to think of himself that way, was leaving to wage a different kind of war. He departed the wall with Stannis' host, a ragtag assembly of Baratheon men, clans from the Vale who had come up in support, Sellswords, and a handful of northern lords who yet remembered Ned Stark's honor and saw in Stannis a claim worth backing. Jon's possessions were few: the clothes on his back, the sword Longclaw at his hip, and the loyalty of Ghost. Sam stood at the gate to see him off, tears in his eyes. "You'll be a good lord," Sam said softly, struggling to muster a smile. "Better than most, and the realm needs that." Jon grasped Sam's hand. He wanted to tell Sam that he would always think of Castle Black as home, that he'd do everything in his power to protect them from the horrors advancing from the lands of always winter. But the words caught in his throat, so he only forced a nod. He turned and led Ghost after him, his direwolf padding silently through the snow. He was half sure he would never see the wall again. The days that followed were a brutal journey southward. The wind was savage, the roads half buried in snowdrifts. Stannis' men, already battered from their campaign and the vicious cold, did not travel quickly. Their supply lines were tenuous. Hunger gnawed at them. Even so, the king pressed onward, a stoic figure who commanded respect through sheer will. As they trudged along, Jon found himself lost in thought, wrestling with the enormity of what he had done. He often laid awake in his tent at night, listening to the howling wind and the murmur of uneasy soldiers. He would drift to sleep, haunted by dreams of direwolves, crypts beneath Winterfell, and white walkers with ice-blue eyes. At Eastwatch, a raven had arrived with uncertain tidings. The Boltons were indeed entrenching themselves in Winterfell, consolidating power. Rumors hinted that Sansa Stark might be in their custody, or Theon Greyjoy, who had once betrayed Winterfell, might be. Others whispered that Roose Bolton's new wife, Fat Valda Frey, was carrying a child, which might complicate Ramsay's position as an heir. Everything was uncertain. The one thing certain was that Winterfell needed to be reclaimed, lest the stain of the Red Wedding darken the entire north for good. So each day's march became a test of will. In Stannis' war council, Jon was given a seat now, though it felt strange. He was used to being overlooked or disregarded, the bastard who lurked in the shadows. Now men looked to him with expectation. They called him Lord Stark, or sometimes my lord, and every time it happened, a prickling sense of unreality made Jon wonder if he truly deserved this. But he reminded himself that if there was a chance to do good, to save the North, then this was the path he must walk. Melisandre's presence unnerved him. She seemed fascinated by him, ever watchful. When he caught her eyes, she would smile with an odd flicker of triumph, as if she had known his destiny all along. Sometimes, she offered cryptic pronouncements about Azor Ahai, a prophesied warrior of the light, or about the darkness gathering in the far north. Jon did not trust her completely, but he felt a grudging acknowledgement that she cared about the White Walkers and the threat they posed. She burned with conviction that the Lord of Light needed her to guide Stannis, and perhaps to guide Jon as well. Slowly, they advanced toward Deepwood Motte, where Lady Glover had made her seat. She had bent the knee to Stannis earlier, albeit reluctantly, and had provided a small force to fight against the Boltons. The Glovers had no great love for House Bolton, not after the Ironborn had sacked their lands and the Boltons had proven themselves treacherous to the old Stark cause. When Jon arrived, riding at Stannis' side, the battered keep of Deepwood Motte seemed a sign of what was left of the North, scarred, yet unbroken in spirit. Lady Glover, a steel-haired woman with sorrow in her eyes, welcomed Jon with courtesy, acknowledging him as Lord Stark. He could see how she measured him, searching for signs of the boy she might recall from years past. All she found was a man hardened by the wall, eyes shadowed by burdens beyond his age. She did not smile, but she bowed her head politely. "We have precious little to give," Lady Glover told them in the main hall. The tapestries were moth-eaten, many of the tables broken or missing. Food stores run low. Winter sets in, but our swords fight better on home ground than you might think. Give us a chance to see Bolton men break beneath our steel, and we'll stand with you until the end. Stannis inclined his head. You'll have that chance, my lady. We march on Winterfell soon. Jon spoke quietly, unsure of how much authority he truly had. We must also find allies among the mountain clans. The Boltons expect us to starve out here in the snow, but we can use the high ground, the knowledge of the passes. Find those loyal to House Stark, and we can surprise them. She nodded. If we can bring the clans to your cause, the Boltons may find themselves encircled. Talk of strategy continued late into the night. Jon tried to keep his mind fixed on the immediate threat. How to gather more men, how to plan an approach to Winterfell, how to safeguard the smaller northern houses caught in the crossfire. Still, a part of him yearned to ride ahead, to see the old gates, to walk the walls where he had once strolled with his siblings. That home had been the cradle of his dreams and the seat of his unspoken envy that he was never quite a true Stark. Now, ironically, it fell to him to reclaim it. The injustice of the world was never lost on him. A few days later, having resupplied as best they could, the host pressed on. At Moat Cailin, they found the old stronghold in as dire a shape as the rest of the north, battered by war, partially collapsed. There they secured the crossing from further southern encroachments. Bit by bit, Stannis' plan took shape. They would rally local houses, glean what men they could, while the Boltons expected them to freeze in the open. If fortune was kind, they might arrive at Winterfell with enough force for a siege. For Jon, this slow crawl south, measured in miles of snow-laden roads, was a torment. His mind was plagued with questions. How would the northern lords who once followed Robb Stark react to the news that a bastard was now declared Jon Stark? Would they flock to him, or spurn him as an up-jumped oathbreaker? Would they take Stannis' claim to the Iron Throne seriously? And what about the White Walkers? Each league south they marched was another league away from the wall. Melisandre sometimes sought him out when he lingered on the edges of camp. Dressed in her red robes, the faint smell of incense clung to her. "You feel the cold more than you should, Lord Stark," she said one evening. "The wall no longer protects you from the chill that creeps into the realm. But remember, the power of the Lord of Light is with those who serve his cause." Jon gave her a sidelong glance. He stood by a sputtering fire. "I've no wish to serve any god but the old gods, my lady." She looked at him with amusement. "Ah, but perhaps they have abandoned their weirwoods. The real war is between Lawler and the Great Other, the one who brings the cold and darkness." She tilted her head. "I see shadows in you, Jon Snow. Shadows of the ones who came before, and shadows of what is to come. It draws me to you." Her words made his skin prickle, but he gave her no reply. He had grown tired of her cryptic talk. She seemed to have an endless supply of riddles, none of which eased the burdens he bore. Only once did he challenge her about the White Walkers, and she replied that her flames had shown her an endless night, a tide of icy darkness that threatened to overwhelm the realms of men, and that certain chosen warriors, Stannis among them, would stand against that night. She said nothing about whether Jon might be such a warrior, but her gaze implied as much. Jon shoved the thought aside. He had enough troubles of the mortal kind without delving into prophecy. Scouting parties returned with news of Bolton patrols along the eastern roads. The cunning flayed man banner flew from watchtowers, daring them to approach. Each time Jon heard of Bolton men, he felt a simmer of rage. He thought of the treachery that had slain Robb. He thought of how Ramsay had hunted down innocents for sport. Winterfell, that seat of honor and tradition, rotted under their rule. The desire to reclaim it was no mere matter of duty. It felt almost personal. He wanted them gone. He wanted Winterfell freed from the stain of their tyranny. Whenever he looked at Ghost, trotting quietly behind him, he remembered the pups they had found in the snow so long ago. The memory brought him a measure of clarity. The Starks had always been guardians of the North. Now, if the old gods still watched, he prayed they might guide his hand. Their columns finally reached the fringes of the mountains, where the Highland clans held sway. Stannis sent out envoys bearing the name of Jon Stark, promising that the rightful blood of Winterfell had returned, now joined with the king's cause. Whether for the name or for the memory of Ned Stark, the clan chiefs began to appear, some of them bristling with distrust for any southerner but curious to see if these tidings were true. Jon found himself at councils with men like the Grachan's cousins, the Wools and the Norreys, who glared at Stannis but gave Jon respectful nods. In him they saw the ghost of Eddard Stark, perhaps, or they at least heard the echo of Ned's honesty. Jon had never been adept at politics, but he told them plainly, "The Boltons must be cast out. Winterfell must be won back. We face a long winter and a dark threat from beyond the wall. If we don't stand together, there will be no North left to protect." Those words were enough for some. The memory of Ned Stark, combined with the savage hatred many northern families bore the Boltons, was impetus enough. The mountain clans, hardy and proud, swore to follow Jon Stark so long as they were led with Stark honor. The golden-headed soldiers of House Baratheon meant little to them, but they would march if they saw that the old ways might be restored. Each new vow they received seemed to strengthen Stannis' resolve. Jon watched the king cast an appraising eye on him. Stannis was not the most genial man, but Jon sensed he recognized that the name Stark was the key to winning hearts in the north. The rightful blood, so far as many believed, stood among them now. Despite the swelling support, it was still a meager host compared to what Roose Bolton commanded behind Winterfell's walls. Rumor had it that the Dreadfort men, the Karstarks who had shifted their allegiance, and other northern houses that had bent the knee to the Boltons for survival were rallying at Winterfell. They had provisions, the advantage of defending stone walls, and the cunning of their new warden of the north. Stannis' men were exhausted, half-starved, and morale wavered under the unrelenting cold. Yet the approach continued. Every day they drew closer to the seat of House Stark, across frozen fields and through forests stripped bare of leaves. With the shorter days, the gloom set in quickly, and men huddled around fires that flickered in the wind. Jon patrolled the camp himself some nights, ensuring discipline, offering words of encouragement where he could. He felt the weight of leadership pressing down on his shoulders in a way he had never felt at the wall. Then came the day they stood on the outskirts of Winterfell's domain. There, a league away, the fortress loomed beneath an iron-gray sky. Smoke curled from its chimneys, the walls thick with watchmen. Once, the sight of Winterfell had warmed Jon's heart home, albeit a home that had never fully been his. Now it looked forbidding, a fortress in the hands of those who had betrayed every Stark that ever walked there. The banners of the flayed man hung from ramparts, bright red against the snow, and the memory of Robb's death at the Twins came unbidden to Jon's mind. He trembled with anger. They made camp outside the range of the archers' bolts and prepared for a siege. Tents dotted the snowy field, and the men set about building trenches, piling earthworks to protect themselves from sorties. Snow fell lightly at first, swirling among the tired soldiers, until day gave way to night. That evening, as the army settled in, Jon stood at the crest of a small ridge that overlooked the sprawl of tents. Ghost stood beside him, ears pricked. Torchlight glimmered below, bobbing where men huddled around fires. The walls of Winterfell rose beyond, forbidding and familiar. A tide of emotions swarmed in Jon's chest. Longing, dread, determination. He let out a breath that fogged in the frigid air. Tomorrow or the next day they would begin this final push. Morning dawned pale and cold. Stannis' war horns sounded, echoing across the plain. Snow crunched underfoot as men arrayed themselves. The plan? To approach the gates, to demand Bolton surrender in the name of King Stannis and Lord Stark. That was the courtesy a siege demanded, though none expected success. The Boltons would never surrender unless forced. Still, a herald rode forward with banners flapping, accompanied by a small escort. Jon rode at Stannis' side. The gates of Winterfell remained shut. Archers stood at the parapets, eyes trained. The herald shouted, "Open these gates in the name of King Stannis Baratheon, rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, and Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, by blood of Ned Stark. For a long moment, there was no answer but the wind. Finally, a voice called down, mocking, "We know no King Stannis. We know no Jon Stark. Begone, crows and traitors, else we serve you as flayed meat for our hounds." Jon's jaw tensed. Stannis's face was a mask of grim determination. They withdrew beyond bow range back to their lines. Now there would be no illusions. A siege or a direct assault, either way it would be bloody. Stannis began giving orders, commanding his men to settle in for a long campaign. He wanted siege engines, catapults if possible, trenches to protect from Bolton cavalry. But the snow was their worst enemy. Rations grew scarcer by the day. Desertions threatened. Some nights, Bolton horsemen would raid the perimeter, setting fires or stealing supplies, then vanish into the night. The men endured, fueled by Stannis's iron will and the fervor of those who revered the Stark name. Jon did not rest. He joined the patrols that tried to counter Bolton raids. Ghost served as a silent sentinel, picking up scents of infiltration. After a few nights of constant sabotage, Stannis convened Jon and the key northern lords in his command tent. By candlelight, they debated what to do next. "If we try a direct assault, we'll bleed ourselves dry on the walls," said Ser Justin Massey, scrubbing a hand over his tired face. "The Boltons are no fools. They'll hold out, sally occasionally, but let hunger and the weather do most of the killing." Jon stared at the map, traced the lines of the fortress. "Winterfell has a massive curtain wall. We'd need siege towers and scaling ladders. The men would be vulnerable to arrow fire." He tapped a spot near the old Godswood. "There's a postern gate near the eastern side. In the old days, it led to the forests. If we can slip a small force in, we might open the main gate from within." A dangerous gamble, they all knew, but with supplies running low, it might be the only way to spare them a months-long siege. Stannis folded his arms. "A small force led by you. You know Winterfell best among us, Lord Stark." Jon dipped his head. "I'll take volunteers. Men with stealth, mountain clansmen who can move quietly. We'll go at night. If we can open the gates, the rest of you will storm the courtyard." The plan was agreed upon, albeit with reservations. Stannis gave Jon a long look, as if to gauge whether he was truly prepared to risk himself on a mission that might well be suicide. Jon returned that look evenly, an unspoken vow in his eyes. He would not hide behind others when Winterfell was at stake. In truth, fear gnawed at him. Memories of the courtyard, the crypts, and the library tower flooded his thoughts whenever he pictured setting foot inside. But he would not shrink away. The night they chose was moonless, clouds obscuring what scant light might have illuminated the castle's defenses. The men chosen for the infiltration gathered at the fringe of camp. Jon wore dark leathers instead of the bright surcoat Stannis had gifted him. He left behind any insignia that might catch a guard's eye. The clansmen were similarly dressed, their faces smeared with soot, carrying ropes and grappling hooks. They would circle around to the eastern side, where the walls abutted the old Godswood, hoping the towering weirwoods might screen them from watchful eyes. Ghost came with them, for stealth was part of his nature. Jon looked each man in the eye, seeing the determination glimmer there. They all knew the stories, they all knew the cause. They moved out silently, leaving the flicker of Stannis's campfires behind. Snow crunched underfoot, each step taken with painstaking care to avoid noise. The black silhouettes of Winterfell's walls loomed larger until they stood in the tree line of the Godswood, shadows among shadows. A guard patrol passed overhead, torchlight flaring along the battlements. Jon's heart pounded in his ears. He recalled how many times he had roamed the courtyard as a boy. Now he skulked like a thief trying to reclaim what was stolen. He motioned for the men to wait, signaled for quiet. When the patrol vanished, they crept forward. The postern gate was there, a small wooden door set into the outer wall. Barricaded, no doubt, but hopefully not heavily manned. Two of the clansmen carefully set a grapple in the rough stones of the wall and began to climb. Jon stroked Ghost's fur to keep him still. The direwolf's ears were pricked, alert. He smelled men behind the walls, no doubt. Once the climbers reached the top, They would secure the rope and let Jon and the others follow. Moments stretched like hours. Then a soft tug on the rope indicated success. One by one, the men climbed in near-total darkness. Jon went last, heart hammering with every inch. A slip, a clang, and all would be lost. But the old gods were with them that night, or luck was. They reached the top of the wall to see a parapet and a guard slumped not far away, dozing in the cold. The clansmen had already dispatched a second guard quietly. Jon stepped onto the walkway, scanning the courtyard below. Torches lit certain areas, but large swaths were in darkness. They must move quickly. They descended a narrow stair. At the bottom, Jon recognized a side corridor that led near the Great Keep. Part of him marveled at how memory returned even after so many years. The air smelled of musty straw and old stone. Another guard rounded a corner, started at the sight of them, but had no time to raise an alarm before a clansman's dagger found his throat. Every death weighed on Jon, but there was no choice. This was war. With swift steps, they located the postern gate from the inside. It was barred with a thick plank, a pair of iron locks. They worked in near silence, prying the bar free, picking the locks. All the while, Jon's ears strained for the shuffle of boots, the ring of steel, any sign that the entire castle was rousing. Outside, Stannis' men would be positioned, waiting for the gate to open. When the final lock clicked, one of the clansmen slowly eased the door outward. Cold air rushed in, along with the dark silhouettes of more men, Stannis' vanguard. Their plan was working, at least thus far. Jon quickly waved them through, and more came, armed and determined. They fanned out, taking the courtyard by surprise. A few Bolton guards rushed forward, tried to shout warnings, but the wave of intruders overwhelmed them. Chaos erupted in the courtyard. Shouts and steel rang out, the clash echoing off walls that had once rung with laughter in Jon's youth. Men in Bolton livery poured out of nearby barracks, brandishing swords and spears. Horns sounded an alarm. Overhead, archers scrambled to vantage points. The night sky flickered with torches. Jon's infiltration group fought fiercely, cutting through the confusion to open the main gate. Heavy chains rattled, and soon the rest of Stannis' main force poured into Winterfell's courtyard. Darkness exploded into a riot of flame and shadow. Horses screamed, men cursed, and the snow quickly turned red with blood. Jon found himself locked in a deadly dance. Longclaw whispered free of its scabbard, and he parried a blow from a Bolton man who snarled curses at him. Ghost sprang onto another, dragging him down with savage ferocity. Jon advanced, every stroke of Longclaw guided by the training he had honed at Castle Black. Memories of training with Robb, of sparring in the yard, fueled each strike. He cut down one foe, slammed his pommel into another's face. The clang of steel drowned out all else. Stannis' banners soon appeared, the flaming heart of the Lord of Light and the stag crowned by flame, flapping in the wind. Bolton men fell back, fighting for each yard. Some retreated toward the Great Hall, some attempted to regroup near the armory. All around, the north came alive with the thunder of war. The mountain clans roared battle cries, demanding Bolton blood. The older northern lords who had come with Stannis shouted oaths of vengeance. Jon heard a voice calling, "For the Starks!" and his heart clenched. The words felt surreal. He fought his way deeper into the castle, searching for Roose Bolton or Ramsay. If the heads of the snake were cut off, the rest might yield. As he crossed the snowy courtyard, he passed the broken remnants of a training dummy where he had once practiced as a boy. The sense of violated nostalgia spurred him on, fury burning in his gut. He saw a swarm of Bolton men forming a shield wall near the entrance to the Great Keep. The door opened and out stepped Ramsay Bolton, broad-shouldered, clad in black leathers, pale eyes gleaming with malice. He held a sword in one hand, a flail in the other, and the black hounds on his sigil seemed to snarl in the torchlight. Ramsay's voice cut across the din. "You bastards think you can take my home?" He laughed, an unhinged sound. "Father will have your hides for cloaks." Jon snarled under his breath. Winterfell was not Ramsay's home. "Winterfell belongs to the Starks," he shouted back, though his voice was lost in the tumult. A wave of men crashed forward, attempting to break the shield wall. Bolton archers peppered the yard with arrows. Stannis's men threw themselves into the fray, and the courtyard became a hell of swirling violence. Jon advanced, his arms burning from the effort of constant swordplay. A Bolton spearman lunged for him, but Jon sidestepped and slashed across the man's exposed flank. Blood splashed across the snow. Another came from behind, but Ghost intercepted, jaws snapping. The chaos was everywhere. Jon saw a flash of red hair. Melisandre was somewhere in the castle, chanting prayers to the Lord of Light. He glimpsed Davos, face grim, rallying a group of Baratheon soldiers. The fighting was so intense Jon could barely track it all. A shriek rose from somewhere behind him, and flames leapt high as a thatched roof caught fire. Bit by bloody bit, they pushed the Bolton men back from the courtyard. Some escaped into the corridors, continuing to resist. It was not a swift or bloodless victory. Men from both sides lay dying, their cries echoing in the once hallowed halls. As dawn's first pale light broke, the battlefield revealed the wounded, the dead, the battered. Yet Stannis's banners flew at the gate. The dire wolf of House Stark had yet to be raised, but already the flayed man's standard had been torn down from the ramparts. Word spread that Roose Bolton had been found inside the Great Keep, locked in a confrontation with a group of mountain clansmen. He was wounded, and his men had fallen around him. In a last defiant stand, the Warden of the North fought, cursing the name of the Starks. But outnumbered and surrounded, the once fearsome lord was slain. Jon had not been there to see Roose Bolton's final moments, but he felt the ripple of relief that coursed through the men. Without Roose, the Bolton cause might collapse. Their men were scattered, or else barricaded in corners of the keep. Ramsay, though, was nowhere to be found by sunrise, and that troubled Jon. He joined a search party, combing the corridors and the dim passageways that wound through Winterfell's heart. Ancient stone arches loomed overhead. He passed by the old library tower, half-burned in the Ironborn attack. He saw the spot where the Stark crypts descended into the earth. His breath caught. Part of him yearned to descend, to kneel before the tombs of the old kings and his father. But for now, he forced himself to search for his father's murderer's spawn. The halls were thick with drifting smoke, the aftermath of the fires set in the night's chaos. Bodies lay slumped by the walls. Some wore the flayed man, others the crowned stag, others yet wore no sigil at all. When at last they came to the old kitchens, a group of Stannis' soldiers confronted a pack of hounds let loose. The beasts snarled, snapping at any who approached. Among them stood Ramsay, flail in hand, eyes gleaming with savage delight. He was cornered, but like a beast driven to bay, that made him more dangerous. "You think you can take my bride, my home, everything from me?" he growled. "I'll feed your guts to my dogs." His men were dead or fled, so he stood alone, the hounds bristling at his side. Jon shoved forward. Ghost pressed at his flank, lips curled. He could smell the fear and madness in Ramsay. "This is over," Jon said. "Bolton is finished. Surrender or die." A sneer curled Ramsay's lips. "Die? Possibly. But not before I've had my fun." And he lashed out, the spiked ball of the flail whistling through the air. One of Stannis' soldiers raised a shield, but the blow shattered the wood, sending splinters flying. Ramsay's hounds lunged, ignoring Ghost for the moment as they sank their teeth into the nearest man's leg. Screams pierced the air. Jon stepped in, swinging Longclaw in a downward arc that forced Ramsay to leap back. The hounds snarled, but Ghost was among them in an instant, snapping at their throats. Despite the pain in his limbs and the horror of the scene, Jon pressed Ramsay, blow after blow. Ramsay's flail was unwieldy in such tight confines, but he used it with savage skill, forcing Jon to keep his distance. A spiked ball nearly caught Jon's shoulder, but he twisted aside at the last moment, the wind of it ruffling his hair. With a grunt, Jon swung Longclaw again, aimed low. Ramsay brought his flail chained down to parry, but steel bit into steel, and the flail flew from his hand, clattering to the ground. Ramsay snarled, reached for a dagger at his belt, but Jon kicked him hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back. Blood from the wounded soldier stained the floor. Ramsay's hounds, now locked with Ghost, were either dead or whimpering. Ghost emerged from the scuffle with a gash along his flank, but still standing. Ramsay looked around, saw he was alone, cornered at last. He lunged for Jon with the dagger, a wild, desperate strike. Jon sidestepped. The dagger slashed across his arm, drawing a hot line of pain, but Jon bared his teeth in grim resolve. He drove his pommel into Ramsay's jaw, sending the man reeling. Then, with a twist of his grip, he pressed Longclaw's tip to Ramsay's throat. Ramsay's chest heaved, eyes burning with hatred. "You're a bastard," he spat, blood flecking his lips. "You have no right." Jon's hand tightened on the hilt. "I am Jon Stark, by the King's decree and by Ned Stark's blood, and this is my home." He stared down at Ramsay, the man who had brought terror to the north. Memories of all Ramsay had done, all the innocents he had tortured, twisted inside Jon like a cold iron blade. He should have answered with an execution then and there. But part of him wavered, recalling Ned Stark's code of justice, that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Jon's gaze flickered to the hounds that Ramsay had used as living weapons. "No more. Winterfell is done with you." Ramsay only grinned through bloody teeth. "Then do it, my lord. Your father would be so proud." There was mockery in his voice, or perhaps acceptance of the inevitable. Jon's face hardened. In one swift motion, he stepped behind Ramsay, reversed Longclaw, and rammed the pommel into the back of the man's skull, sending him face first to the ground. Ramsay lay unconscious or close to it. Perhaps it was more mercy than he deserved, but a part of Jon wanted him to stand trial, to face justice before the lords of the north. If only so there could be no question about the outcome. Stannis' soldiers quickly bound Ramsay. The unconscious man was dragged away to a secure cell, where he would await the king's judgment. Jon pressed a hand to the cut on his arm, staunching the trickle of blood. Weariness crashed over him, but he forced himself to stand. The Great War might be waiting beyond the horizon, but at least Winterfell was reclaimed. By day's end, the flayed man banners had been torn down entirely, replaced with the crowned stag and, at long last, the dire wolf of House Stark. That final moment, when the grey dire wolf was raised over Winterfell again, brought tears to more than a few eyes among the northern soldiers. The ghost of Ned Stark seemed to whisper through the winds. Jon stood at the top of the walls, gazing over the courtyard filled with the survey. Vores of the battle. The air smelled of blood, smoke, and the crisp tang of fresh snow. Soldiers were picking through rubble, gathering the wounded, and piling the dead for burial. He swallowed hard. Stannis joined him at the battlement, his face set in that stony mask. "It's done," the king said. "The Boltons are routed. The North has its seat back." Jon exhaled, watching his breath disperse in the air. "It's not over," he said, voice hoarse. "This is just one battle." Stannis gave a curt nod, and for once, his tone held a trace of something akin to camaraderie. "Aye, but you hold the ancestral seat of House Stark. Make use of it. The North will gather here under your banner, and they will rally to me in turn. We'll secure the rest of the territory soon enough." His mouth pressed into a thin line. "You've done well, Jon Stark." Those words offered a strange sense of validation. Perhaps Stannis, rarely one to dole out praise, recognized the significance of Jon's role. Still, Jon's thoughts wandered beyond the walls. The White Walkers loomed in the dark, unstoppable in the long winter that had begun. The realm was fracturing under the weight of myriad conflicts. Yet here and now, in the battered courtyard of Winterfell, hope flickered anew. The North had reclaimed its heart. That evening, as the battered army settled in the halls of Winterfell, feasting in subdued exhaustion, Jon walked alone to the Godswood. Torchlight cast dancing shadows on the ancient weirwood trees. The central weirwood, with its carved face, had stood sentinel for thousands of years. Red leaves rustled above, though many had been cast onto the snow. Jon knelt there, letting the hush of the place envelop him. Ghost stood quietly at his side, tongue lolling, his white fur faintly tinged with the blood of battle. Jon recalled how many times his father had prayed here, how many times Robb had offered pleas to the old gods. "We're home," he murmured, half to Ghost, half to the old gods. His voice caught in his throat. "But so many are gone. Father, Robb, Mother, maybe even Bran and Rickon. Wherever they are, if they're alive." He closed his eyes. The wind sighed in the branches overhead, as if the old gods themselves were breathing. Jon felt the pang of longing. Part of him wanted to cast aside the burdens of this new title, to be a brother of the Night's Watch again, free from the weight of leadership. But it was too late for that. "Winterfell needs a Stark," he whispered, "and I'm the only one left to do it." The hush of the godswood gave no reply, save the soft rustle of leaves. After a moment, he pressed his hand against the scarred bark of the weirwood. The face carved there stared impassively, red sap tears dripping from its carved eyes. He remembered how the Starks had always said, "When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives." He wondered if, one day, the pack might be reunited. When he emerged from the godswood, he found Davos Seaworth waiting for him. The Onion Knight offered a small bow. "My lord," he said with a gentle smile, "the king wishes to speak with you." Jon nodded, adjusting his sword belt. They walked through the courtyard, stepping gingerly around debris from the night's fight. He thought of how much rebuilding would be required. The great hall was scorched in places. Part of the training yard walls had collapsed. But Winterfell's hot springs still steamed faintly, a reminder that life stirred here. They passed men and women rummaging for supplies, seeing to the wounded. Everyone recognized Jon as the new Lord Stark. Some gave him respectful nods. Others murmured blessings that a Stark was home at last. In the Great Keep, Stannis had claimed a council chamber once used by Ned. The table was simpler than the one in Dragonstone, but a map of the North was spread across it. Stannis, Melisandre, and a handful of northern lords, including Lady Glover, stood around it. Stannis acknowledged Jon with a curt greeting. "Jon Stark, the rightful seat is yours, but the North is not fully under our control. The Karstarks, the Umbers, the Manderleys. Some have bent the knee to the Boltons or have sworn themselves to other interests. We must bring them to heel." Jon glanced at the map. The mention of the Umbers particularly caught his attention. House Umber had been staunchly loyal to the Starks in the past, but the threat of the Boltons might have forced their hand. "We should send ravens," Jon said. "Inform them that Winterfell has returned to House Stark. Give them a chance to declare their loyalty." One of the clan chiefs snorted. "And if they don't come, they cower behind their walls, waiting for a new victor to claim them. Then we treat them as enemies," Stannis said flatly. "But first we extend the courtesy of a choice. They might see reason." His gaze flicked to Jon. "You should sign those letters as Jon Stark, rightful Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North. That will carry weight." Jon nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. He had never put his name to paper as a Stark. The notion felt both exhilarating and daunting. But if it could unite the North, he would do it. "Yes, I'll write them tonight." Stannis traced a line across the map with a gloved finger. "We must also think of the White Walkers. You know the threat better than any of us, Jon. Word from the Wall has been sporadic, but I trust that your brothers still stand watch." "Yes," Jon said quietly, "but they're few. We must muster the North if we hope to survive the army of the dead. For that, we need unity. If the rest of Westeros ignores our warnings, we can at least try to stand together." The cold winds are rising. Stannis's expression was grim. "Melisandre has told me of the darkness in her flames. Cannot ignore it. We must finish securing the North, deal with any scattered Bolton forces, then prepare for the war to come. With or without the realm's support, we will stand here." He gave Jon a level look. "The North is your charge, my lord. I expect you to see it done." Jon recognized the burden those words carried. He bowed his head in acknowledgement. "I will do everything I can. If only it were so simple." The lords of the North had been splintered by betrayal, war, and the uncertain claims to the Iron Throne. But maybe, just maybe, the name Stark would be enough to rally them when winter pressed hardest. Over the following weeks, a semblance of order settled in Winterfell. Despite the battered walls and scorched timbers, the castle's ancient resilience endured. Repairs began under the supervision of men who had once served the Starks. Civilians from the nearby Wintertown crept back, braving the fear that lingered. Jon tried to lead as best he could, recalling all the times he had seen Ned Stark dispense justice, hold audience, or speak with the small folk. He strove for fairness. He had little time to rest. By day, he met with local leaders, accepted fealty from knights who realized the tide had turned, and wrote endless letters to houses across the north, urging them to return to the Stark fold. By night, he wrestled with nightmares of the White Walkers advancing south. Ramsay Bolton remained imprisoned in the dungeons. Stannis decreed that he would face the king's justice soon enough. Jon found he rarely had the stomach to visit that cell, though occasionally he worried that leaving Ramsay alive was a mistake. The man's cunning knew no bounds, but something in Jon balked at a swift, secret execution. He wanted the North to see that this was not some petty score settling. Justice had to be done openly. So Ramsay languished, surly and muttering, plotting an escape that never came. One chill dawn, a herald arrived from the wall bearing grim tidings. More wildlings had sought refuge south of the wall, fleeing renewed White Walker attacks. The men of the Night's Watch were stretched thin. Jon read the letter with shaking hands, thinking of Sam, Ed, and all the friends he'd left behind. The letter's final lines were a plea for more men, for more help, for any resources the new Lord of Winterfell could spare. A heaviness settled in Jon's chest. He brought the letter to Stannis immediately. "We have to send aid," Jon said, brimming with urgency. "The walkers are pressing closer, raising the dead in their wake. The Watch won't hold them alone." Stannis's lips thinned. "And how do we feed another campaign northward? We barely have enough to feed our own men, let alone march them north, when half the North is still rebellious or uncertain in its loyalties." He tapped a finger on the map. "And the Karstarks are rumored to have mustered near their holdfast, refusing to bend the knee." "But if we wait," Jon said, unable to hide his desperation, "the wall will fall. And once it falls..." Davos, standing near the king, spoke gently. "My lord, your concerns are valid. The real enemy may well be these White Walkers. But the king is right that we can't leave the North in chaos. We need to secure allies and provisions first. Otherwise, we march to our deaths." Jon raked a hand through his dark hair. "Time is not our ally. The days grow colder. I know what's out there. We need to be ready. I'll go myself if I must." Stannis regarded him levelly. "I need you here. You're Warden of the North now. But we can dispatch a token force, perhaps, to reinforce the wall if you can guarantee that we won't starve. Show me you can bring the Karstarks, the Umbers, the Manderleys to heel. Then we'll talk about a larger expedition." Jon clenched his fists but knew that Stannis was not entirely wrong. Without the cooperation of the major houses, a march north would be suicide. Provisioning an army in winter was no trivial matter. Still, it weighed heavily on his conscience. Every night, the nightmares were more vivid. An army of the dead, unstoppable, rolling over the land. So began another round of negotiations and missions. Ravens flew from Winterfell, some carrying pleas, others bearing more severe threats. Jon sent envoys to the Karstarks, reminding them of their old oaths to House Stark. He dispatched men to treat with the Manderleys at White Harbor, hoping to rekindle their loyalty. Word trickled back that House Manderley was in a precarious position, threatened by the wrath of the Iron Throne if they openly defied the Bolton-Lannister alliance. Yet the Manderleys remembered the Starks fondly. The Umbers, fierce and proud, were rumored to have lost their great Jon in captivity at the Twins. His heir might be more malleable, or might be filled with bitterness at the war that had claimed so many. The tapestry of alliances was tangled. Jon, once just a steward or ranger at the wall, found himself at the heart of a web of politics. Only the memory of his father's lessons guided him. Honor, fairness, duty, that was what it meant to be a Stark. He hoped that was enough. As the weeks wore on, small successes appeared. A few Karstark riders came to parley, bearing half-hearted apologies for ignoring the summons. They were uncertain, worried that Stannis might lose his war for the Iron Throne, leaving them exposed. But the sight of Winterfell once again bearing the direwolf banner, combined with the promise that House Stark would remember those who stood by them, began to sway them. The Umbers sent a terse reply. They would come to Winterfell to discuss terms. House Manderly had not answered yet, though rumors suggested they might be mustering behind the scenes. In the meantime, Stannis dispatched a small contingent north to reinforce the wall. Fewer men than Jon had hoped, but better than nothing. Winterfell slowly settled into an uneasy routine. The castle's stone halls filled with the bustle of carpenters, stonemasons, blacksmiths. The battered gates were repaired, the collapsed walls rebuilt. Jon spent long hours in the Great Hall, hearing petitions, settling disputes. The small folk started to return to the winter town outside the castle walls, bringing goods and produce to trade, though the biting cold made the yield slim. For Jon, it felt surreal. He was more comfortable on a battlement than a throne-like seat. But each day, the men and women bowed, calling him Lord Stark. Some older folk who remembered Ned or Robb wept at the sight, praising the old gods for returning the Starks to Winterfell. Guilt gnawed at Jon. He was a bastard, legitimized by a king some viewed as a usurper. He had broken vows to the Watch, but if it meant protecting these people, he would bear the mantle of Lord. Ghost roamed the corridors freely, a white shadow that unnerved some of the newly arrived Southerners in Stannis' entourage. The direwolf was a constant reminder of Jon's roots. Sometimes, late at night, Ghost would slip away and return with fresh kills from the woods. The scattered howls of wolves in the distance made the new inhabitants shiver. But Jon found it comforting, a piece of the old life still close at hand. In the quiet moments, Jon could almost feel the presence of his siblings. He imagined Arya tearing through the courtyard with a wooden sword, Rickon chasing Shaggy Dog by the stables, Bran perched on the walls, and Robb smiling, telling him they'd make the North proud. Those ghosts pained him. Even so, they gave him strength. Each day he carried on, forging alliances, overseeing repairs, sending ravens with warnings of the White Walkers. The Great War drew closer, but at least the North was beginning to unite under one banner. Perhaps that was all he could do. Gather strength, watch the roads for the next threat. Then, after a cold dawn, a rider arrived from the south bearing news of Sansa Stark, rumored to be alive and seeking refuge. That news sent Jon's heart pounding in his chest. If Sansa lived, then House Stark was not so diminished. It might even strengthen his claim in the eyes of certain lords. But more than that, it meant a piece of his family yet lived in this broken world. He could only pray she would reach Winterfell safely. And in those prayers, he thanked whatever gods might be listening that he had broken his vow when Stannis offered him the name Stark. Because if Sansa returned, if any of his siblings could be brought home, Winterfell might truly feel whole again. And so, upon that faint, fragile hope, Jon Snow, Jon Stark, carried on, preparing for the wars yet to come, determined to prove worthy of the father he had lost and the name he had inherited, determined to face the White Walkers when the time arrived, to be the shield that guarded the realms of men. Even if it meant carrying the heaviest burden he had ever known. Even if it meant standing alone against an endless night. He was no longer alone, though. He had the North. He had the name Stark. And winter was here. The real war, the Great War, waited in the darkness. But for the first time since the dire news had reached him at the wall, Jon felt a sliver of hope. For what is dead may never die, and the flame of the North had been rekindled at Winterfell, with him bearing the torch. If the old gods still watched, Jon only prayed he would not fail them. And so the story began anew. Jon rose from the Raven's letter and stood at the table in Winterfell Solar, his thoughts swirling in a storm of hope and worry. Sansa Stark was alive. The news, delivered on a single scrap of parchment by a nameless messenger, was unspecific, only that she might be in the western hills near the rills, seeking safe passage north. The letter did not carry her hand, nor the seal of any house Jon recognized. He struggled with the impulse to doubt. He had never been close to Sansa in childhood. Arya was the sister he had felt more kinship with, but the news that a trueborn daughter of Eddard Stark lived changed everything. His chest felt tight, as though it could not contain the relief and anxiety surging inside him. He carefully refolded the letter and pressed it to his breast. The name Stark carried a great weight in the north. If Sansa was indeed on her way, she could help bolster his already precarious hold on the lords who were still on the fence. Yet beyond politics, there was the simple fact: Sansa was his sister. She was flesh and blood. He pictured her as she had been, a poised and proper girl who loved songs and romantic tales of knights. The world had likely hardened her, as it had hardened them all. Still, the notion that one of his siblings might yet survive tugged fiercely at his heart. Outside the solar windows, the winter wind sighed over the battlements. Snow drifted lazily, dusting the courtyard below in a pale hush. Over a month had passed since the recapture of Winterfell. In that time, Jon had busied himself with repairs, audiences, and the unending negotiations of a war-torn land. But this letter cast a new light on all of it. Ghost, lying near the hearth, lifted his head as Jon walked to the window. The direwolf's red eyes followed his every movement. He found his gaze drifting to the distant horizon. If Sansa was indeed in the west, she might have already crossed into the domain of the Ryswells or the Dustons, people whose loyalties had been tangled up with House Bolton. Would they shelter her? Betray her? If the realm truly believed that a Stark resided in Winterfell again, might they see Sansa as a threat or an opportunity? The unknowns were maddening, but Jon forced himself to center his thoughts. He must act. He could not simply wait and hope she appeared at Winterfell's gates unscathed. He quietly called for a steward to fetch Davos Seaworth. If Jon was to organize a rescue, or at least an escort, Davos's counsel would be invaluable. Jon might be Lord of Winterfell now, but Davos was a seasoned hand at navigating harsh circumstances with too few men and too many enemies. In truth, Jon trusted Davos more than he did most of Stannis' advisors. Where Stannis was unyielding, Davos had a sympathetic ear and a knack for finding the less obvious path. Not long after, the soft tread of boots approached. Davos entered the solar, his weathered face as serious as ever. He gave Jon a polite dip of the head. "My lord, you sent for me?" Jon handed him the letter. "News reached me that my sister may be in the hills west of the Rills, seeking safe passage. We know the lands there can be treacherous. Many houses in that region once swore to Bolton out of fear or necessity. I can't let Sansa wander into a trap or starve on the roads. I'm thinking of sending men to find her. Bring her here safely." Davos read quickly, lips pressed together. When he finished, he inhaled a measured breath. "The letter's vague, but it might be true. If she's truly your sister, we can't let her slip through our fingers. The name Stark has weight beyond measure here in the north." He paused. "We'll need to send a small contingent, large enough to defend her, not so large as to draw attention. You wouldn't want House Dustin or House Ryswell assuming an invading force crosses their lands." Jon nodded. "Precisely. Do you think you could arrange it?" Davos scratched at the stubble on his jaw, studying the letter once more. I've some men I trust to keep their heads in a tricky spot. I could lead them myself if you wish, my lord, though the king may have need of me. And you, do you intend to ride out too?" The thought tugged at Jon's heart. Part of him yearned to be the one to find Sansa, to confirm with his own eyes that she lived. But he glanced out the window, seeing the swirl of tasks that had piled upon him since reclaiming Winterfell. The lordship was no simple matter, especially with the state of the north so fragile. "I can't abandon Winterfell now," he said quietly, a trace of regret in his voice. Between the Karstarks, the Umbers, the Manderleys were close to forging alliances that might unite the north, and the White Walkers draw nearer every day. If the houses don't stand with us, we'll all die come the long night. So no, I'll stay here, handle what I must. But I'd have you command the escort if you can manage it. I trust you, Davos. The Onion Knight bowed his head once more. Then I'll see it done. We'll depart as soon as the men are assembled and the king grants his leave. With luck, we'll bring your sister home safely. Jon felt a rush of gratitude and relief. Thank you. Let me know if you require anything. Horses, rations, any official letters to pass through these lands safely. House Ryswell, House Dustin. Some of them might still need convincing that there's a new order at Winterfell. Show them we mean no harm if they remain neutral. But if they threaten you, do what's needed. Davos set the letter on the table. We'll be careful, my lord, and with the gods' grace, we'll deliver Lady Sansa to your side. They parted ways, each weighed by the demands of duty. Outside, in the corridor, Jon drew a breath and tried to still his nerves. If Sansa was indeed returning to him, that changed many things. In the back of his mind, he wondered if the rumors of Arya might one day be proved true as well. And Bran, Rickon, he dared not cling too desperately to hope. The world had proven heartbreak was more common than joy. Still, he cherished this flicker of promise. 2 days later, Davos departed with a company of 20 good men. 10 of Stannis' knights who had proven loyal, 10 from the mountain clans who had thrown in their lot with House Stark. Jon watched them file out of Winterfell's main gate, snow crunching under iron-shod hooves. Their breath billowed in the cold as they vanished down the winding road. Jon felt the pang of wishing he were among them. Instead, he turned back to Winterfell's courtyard, where fresh straw had been laid over the muddy ground. Repairs continued on a collapsed portion of the east wall. Carpenters and masons hammered away, their progress slow in the biting cold. War may have brought them victory here, but now the real struggle lay in rebuilding. In the great hall, the hush of midday gave way to the shuffle of petitioners. Jon took his seat on the dais, where the Stark high seat stood battered but serviceable. The memories of Ned sitting here, or Robb in the days of the king in the north, weighed heavily. Jon tried not to dwell on how unworthy he felt. He reminded himself that he bore this role for the people's sake, to protect the north from both mortal foes and the terrors beyond the wall. One by one, small folk and lesser knights approached with concerns. The meager harvest, disputes over newly assigned quarters, questions about the dangers of roving outlaws in the forests. Jon listened carefully, gave what judgments he could, and promised what assistance Winterfell could spare. Now and then he glanced at the empty seat beside him, once reserved for the Lady of Winterfell. If Sansa returned, she would sit there. The notion both comforted and unsettled him. He had grown used to having no one at his side but Ghost. By day's end, Jon's throat was sore from speaking. He felt as though he had run a marathon in the cold. Ghost followed him to the Solar, where a simple supper of bread, salt cod, and onions waited. Jon ate in silence, mulling over the day's petitions, drafting new instructions for ravens. He scribbled letters to House Serwyn, House Mormont, House Flint, all those who might be swayed by the knowledge that the Boltons were done and a Stark once again held Winterfell. While writing, he caught sight of the battered direwolf sigil on the old Stark stationery. It was a small reminder that everything about his life had changed since the day he bent the knee to Stannis. When he finished, he rose and paced to the window, letting his gaze wander over the courtyard. The days were short now, the nights long and cold, and the overhead sky had the dull, leaden color of an endless winter. A silent longing caught him off guard. He missed the wall. He missed the sense of clear purpose that came with the Night's Watch vow, the brotherhood he had shared with men like Ed and Gren and PYP. The vow he had sworn to hold no land, father no children, remain a sworn brother till death. He'd broken it. Part of him still felt the sting of that betrayal, as though he had lost something fundamental. But he knew there was no going back. The White Walkers marched, and the North needed leadership. If he had not stepped forward, perhaps the Boltons would still hold Winterfell, sowing terror across the land. Perhaps the realm would be even less prepared for the coming darkness. And so he stayed the course, the only course left to him. A week crept by. Stannis was gone on a short campaign to punish a cluster of Bolton loyalists who still harried the king's supply lines in the south of the Neck. In his absence, the weight of running the castle and the region fell entirely on Jon. His nights grew restless, haunted by dreams of a monstrous winter. A few lords of lesser houses arrived to present themselves and pledge fealty, many remarking on how strange it was to see Jon Snow, once a bastard in black, now sitting where Eddard Stark once did. Some were kind, glad that any Stark remained to protect them. Others were suspicious, their eyes scanning the great hall for hidden traps. Jon tried to greet them all with courtesy. He leaned on Lady Glover's counsel in matters of local politics, for she had long known the intricacies of each house's alliances. Her stern advice was invaluable. Then, one gray morning, the watchers on the battlements sounded a horn. A small column of riders approached from the west. Jon hurried to the gate, heart thudding. Were they Davos's men? Had they found Sansa? A swirl of nerves knotted in his gut. He ascended the icy steps 2 at a time, Ghost at his heels, and peered over the ramparts. Yes, these were indeed some of the same knights who had departed days ago. Davos's banner was among them, though the group was smaller than before. At the center, a horse carried a cloaked figure, and Jon's pulse skipped. Could it be her? He ordered the gate to be opened. The drawbridge groaned. The portcullis rattled. The riders filed inside, hooves crunching on the icy ground. Jon descended into the courtyard, ignoring the curious stares of guards and small folk who scurried out of the way. His breath curled in the air as he beheld Davos, who slid off his horse, thick layers of travel dust and frost caking his cloak. The man's face was set in grim lines, but when he saw Jon, a tired smile ghosted over his features. He gestured to the cloaked figure, a woman with auburn hair hidden beneath a hood. Jon inhaled sharply and stepped forward. "Sansa?" he asked in a voice more fragile than he expected. She lifted her face. Though pale and lined with exhaustion, the features were unmistakably those of the girl he remembered. A bit sharper, older, but Sansa Stark's eyes nonetheless. For a moment, she did not speak, only stared as though hardly believing she stood in Winterfell's yard, face to face with him after so many years. Then she exhaled, her breath a trembling cloud in the winter air. "Jon, they said you'd taken Winterfell. I barely believed it." Her voice quivered. She dismounted with Davos's help. The courtyard was utterly still, save for a few whispered exclamations. Someone recognized her hair or the shape of her face, and the name Lady Sansa fluttered among the watchers like a gust of wind. Jon closed the distance between them. He felt awkward. This was the sister he had never been close to, overshadowed by the warmth he'd shared with Arya or the easy camaraderie with Robb. But now none of that mattered. They were all the family each other had, and that knowledge gripped him like a vice. "You're safe now," he said, softly but with conviction. His eyes searched her face for signs of the horrors she might have endured. "You're home." She swallowed, tears pricking her eyes, and she flung her arms around him. He held her, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. Ghost edged closer, sniffing at Sansa's cloak as if trying to confirm her identity. Despite the swirl of watchers, the moment felt oddly private. 2 survivors of a shattered family, clinging to each other in a courtyard that had once been their childhood domain. After a moment, she pulled back, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. Her voice was thick. "I never thought I'd see you here, and as Lord of Winterfell, I-7, it's all so strange." Jon managed a shaky smile. "Yes, it is, but we'll figure it out together." He nodded at Davos, who quietly instructed the men to find stabling for the horses. "Come inside, get warm, we'll talk." He guided Sansa through the gates into the castle proper, watchers parting respectfully. Everyone seemed to realize they had witnessed something extraordinary. The long-lost Stark daughter returning home. Whispers echoed up and down the corridors. Jon's heart still pounded with adrenaline. He cast a sidelong glance at Sansa. How she had grown, taller, gaunter. Yet there was a regal poise to her that reminded him more of Catelyn Stark than he cared to admit. He wondered what heartbreaks and trials she had known since they last parted. The day he left for the Wall and she rode south with their father. That felt like centuries ago. In the warmth of the great hall, Sansa sank gratefully onto a bench near the hearth. Servants rushed to bring hot spiced wine, bread, and a basin of water. Ghost settled at Jon's side, watching everything with the silent vigilance of a direwolf. For a moment, neither sibling spoke. They were both studying each other, uncertain how to bridge the chasm years had wrought. Finally, Jon broke the silence. I don't know where to begin, Sansa. So much has happened. I'm sorry for everything you've endured. She folded her hands in her lap. We've all suffered. Her gaze flickered around the hall, as if recalling happier days, the images of feasts and laughter once held here. When Father died, everything changed. I was thrust into the Lannisters' world. Then Peter Baelish and others manipulated me, used me. Her voice caught. I was forced to marry. Horrible things. She trailed off, her jaw tightening. Jon did not need the details to guess what might have happened, especially if the rumors of her having been in Ramsay's clutches were true. Something inside him went cold with rage at the thought of Ramsay. He was in the dungeon still, but the memory of that vile man's sneer stung anew. Carefully, Jon reached out and laid a hand over Sansa's. You're safe now, he repeated, not knowing what else to say. He can't hurt you again. None of them can. The Boltons are finished. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I know. Davos told me some of what happened, how you and King Stannis took Winterfell, that you accepted a lordship, broke your vows to the Watch. She said it quietly, without accusation, but with a searching gaze. Jon exhaled. Yes, I didn't take the decision lightly. It was the only way to free the North from Bolton rule and, more importantly, prepare for the threat beyond the Wall. He paused, measuring whether to tell her everything about the White Walkers and the army of the dead. Not everyone believed. I pray you'll understand. A faint smile touched her lips, but sadness shadowed her face. I do understand, Jon. We've both done things we never thought we would to survive, to protect what matters. She shifted in her seat, drawing the cloak tight around her shoulders. And now, you're the Lord of Winterfell. The rightful seat belongs to our family. To House Stark. He dipped his head. It belongs to you as much as me. You're trueborn. No, she interjected softly, but firmly. Ned Stark was our father. You are Stark by blood, by everything that matters. Bastard or not, you're the reason we have Winterfell again. I'll not contest your right to rule if that's what you fear. I only want us to stand together as a family. We owe that to everyone we've lost. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A swirl of relief and gratitude filled him. Thank you. We'll stand together, then. Our enemies are many, both the living and the dead. We'll need every ally we can muster. Sansa nodded, sipping at the hot wine a servant had brought. The color slowly returned to her cheeks. Is it true the king is away, fighting Bolton men still in rebellion? Jon explained Stannis' short campaign to the south, how the region was rife with old loyalists to the flayed man. He'll return soon enough, I think. He'll be eager to meet you. Your presence cements his alliance with the North, or so he'll believe. He tried not to sound too cynical. And how did you escape the men who hounded you in the West? Her eyes darkened. I owe my life to a few kind souls. One was a sworn brother of House Barrow who never forgot my father's justice. He and his companions risked their necks to get me away from the Bolton watchmen. It was a near thing. We hid in the hills for days, scrounging for food. Then Davos found us. Jon felt a flash of gratitude for Davos's skill and compassion. I'm sorry you had to endure that. We'll give you a proper chamber, safe and warm. You can rest now. No more running. Sansa's composure cracked a fraction, tears welling in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. Thank you, she whispered. Home. I'd all but given up hope. He squeezed her hand once more, then gently rose. I'll have the servants prepare a chamber, perhaps mother and father's old rooms, unless it would pain you. She closed her eyes, exhaling a trembling breath. "No, I'll face it. I'll face all of it." A moment of silence passed between them, thick with unspoken grief. Then she nodded. Yes, that would be best. Thus, the new Lady Stark was welcomed to Winterfell. The news spread like wildfire through the castle and the surrounding lands. The last missing piece of House Stark, at least in the eyes of the people, had come home at last. Many wept openly, or said prayers of thanks to the old gods. Jon watched how quickly the castle's atmosphere changed. A kind of awe settled over everyone, as though Sansa's very presence reaffirmed that the old ways were returning. Winterfell was healing, however slowly. In the days that followed, Sansa walked the corridors, reacquainting herself with the keep. She visited the Godswood, standing beneath the ancient weirwood where her father had once prayed. Jon gave her space to grieve in private. Occasionally, they shared quiet meals, haltingly exchanging stories of what had happened since they parted. He could see she was scarred, in mind if not in body, and she carried herself with a wary grace. But there was steel beneath that elegance now, a resilience hammered into her by trauma. She asked pointed questions about the alliances Jon was forging, the houses who might or might not support them, and the threat from beyond the wall he kept warning people about. For all her courtesy, she seemed determined to learn how to protect herself and the North. On one evening, as they supped in the solar, she asked him about Ramsay. "Davos told me he was captured. Is that true?" Jon's face hardened. "He's rotting in the dungeons. Stannis wants to pass judgment publicly. There's talk of executing him or sending him to the Night's Watch. But the Watch wouldn't have him, I'm sure. They'd likely fling him off the wall." She was quiet for a time, her eyes downcast. "I hope he suffers," she whispered finally. "I know Father always preached mercy, but—" Her breath shook. "If you knew what he—" She broke off. Jon reached for her hand, and she clasped it so tightly it stung. "I know enough," Jon said. The memory of Ramsay's feral grin still set his blood boiling. "When the king returns, we'll see justice done." She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "We will." Word came not long after that Stannis had won a skirmish at the edge of the Neck, scattering the last pockets of Bolton loyalists. He was returning to Winterfell with his entourage. The idea that Sansa would soon meet Stannis gave Jon a twinge of unease. Stannis could be severe, and Sansa was still fragile. But her presence was a powerful statement of legitimacy for House Stark. Perhaps that would offset Stannis's unbending nature. Jon had more pressing concerns in the meantime. The Karstarks, once close allies to the Starks, had yet to send any definitive reply to Jon's summons. The Umbers threatened to remain aloof, though rumor had it they were gathering men. The Manderleys had written a cautious letter, politely acknowledging Lord Stark but making no firm commitments. If the North was to stand against the White Walkers, Jon needed these houses to join him, not just sit behind their walls. He decided to take a page from Ned Stark's old ways: personal diplomacy. If the lords would not come to him, he would go to them. But Sansa insisted on accompanying him. "These houses might respond better to a trueborn daughter of Ned Stark," she said when he tried to dissuade her. "It's not that I don't trust you, Jon, but you were absent from the North's politics for years. Let me help. Besides, I cannot hide in my chamber forever." He was torn, fearing for her safety on the roads. But she was right. Lady Glover even agreed that Sansa's presence would ease certain proud lords who questioned Jon's legitimacy. The decision was made. They would ride north together to meet with House Umber first, then pass east if time and weather permitted. They would leave enough men to hold Winterfell, trusting that the fortress could fend for itself. Stannis was due back soon, so the castle would not stand unguarded for long. In the dead of winter, traveling in the north carried great risk, but they had little choice. Waiting for ravens was too slow and too uncertain. On a bitter morning, with clouds promising more snow, Jon led a column of 70 men out of Winterfell's gates. A mix of mountain clansmen, sworn swords from houses that had pledged to Jon, and a few Baratheon knights who had opted to join the expedition. At his side rode Sansa, wearing thick furs and a hood. Her face was set in calm determination, though Jon could see a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She had spent too long in captivity to feel truly at ease on the open roads, but she was resolute about her duty. Ghost loped alongside, a silent sentinel. The watchers on the walls called out farewells, their voices echoing in the cold air. They traveled slowly, hampered by drifts and the shortened daylight. Each evening, they sought shelter in a hall or tower that had once sworn fealty to the Starks. The locals often eyed them warily, uncertain of the new order, but Sansa's presence usually won them over. They recognized her auburn hair, her gentle courtesy, the features reminiscent of Lady Catelyn. When Jon introduced himself as Lord Stark, some folk were still surprised. The Ned Stark's bastard? But they mostly held their tongues after seeing how Sansa deferred to him. Each night, Jon took pains to reassure them that Winterfell was secure, that the Boltons were finished, and that a true Stark once more took up the responsibilities of Warden of the North. The small folk did not always look relieved. Fear lingered from years of bloody conflict, but some seemed cautiously hopeful. They approached Last Hearth under a bleak sky. House Umber's seat rose stark and gray, a fortress perched in the rugged northern hills. The Umbers had a reputation for being fierce, boisterous warriors with loyalty as unyielding as iron, yet also proud and difficult when slighted. The great Jon had been among Robb's most stalwart suppo rooters, but rumor held that after Robb's death, the Umbers had splintered. Some turned to the Boltons under duress, others held their lands in quiet defiance, uncertain who would claim the North next. The great Jon himself remained in captivity in the south, though details were vague. Jon's column halted within sight of the gate, a battered stone arch flanked by watchtowers. Men in thick hides and furs observed them from the battlements. A horn resounded, echoing across the snowfield. Jon and Sansa exchanged a look. He signaled forward a herald, who called out, "Open the gates for Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and Lady Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard Stark." Silence stretched. Jon's breath fogged in the cold, and his men shifted uneasily. Then, with a grinding of ancient chains, the gate rose. A voice roared from beyond, "Enter, Stark, the Umbers will hear your words." They rode in slowly, alert for any sign of treachery. The courtyard of Last Hearth was cramped, the walls tall and foreboding. Umbers in rough-spun cloaks stood by, hands on their weapons. At the hall's entrance stood a large man with a thick beard, an imposing presence even in stillness. Jon recognized him as Mors Umber, known as the Small Jon once, though that name had always been half in jest, given his size. The Great Jon's kin. The man's eyes flicked over the arriving party, lingering on Sansa. Then he barked a command for stable hands to see to the horses and told Jon and Sansa to follow him inside. In the hall, a great fire roared in a central pit, casting dancing shadows on the timber beams overhead. The smell of roasting meat and pine resin drifted through the air. Men and women with the stark features of the Umbers crowded near, curious. Mors Umber turned to face Jon, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "I see 2 Starks come to my doors," he rumbled, voice echoing in the smoky hall. "One was a bastard of Ned's, last I heard. The other, a lost girl rumored to be wed to a monster. The world's been turned upside down, it seems." Jon inclined his head, ignoring the flicker of anger in his gut. "We have indeed come a long road, but you are correct. I was born a bastard of Ned Stark. King Stannis saw fit to legitimize me, and with the Boltons dethroned, I stand as Lord of Winterfell. Lady Sansa, my sister, is here to confirm our house has returned." Sansa raised her chin, her voice steady. "The Boltons forced me into marriage, but I escaped. Roose Bolton is dead, Ramsay is captured. Winterfell is ours again. My father always spoke of House Umber with respect. We hope that respect can bind us once more." Mors studied them with a critical eye. "We served the kings in the north for centuries. The great Jon marched with your brother Robb and lost much in the war. House Umber has bled for the Starks, and yet, when the Red Wedding came, we got no quarter. Our lord's been held prisoner in the Twins. Meanwhile, the Boltons demanded our fealty or threatened to flay our kin. Some of us had no choice but to bend the knee, at least in name. We've endured betrayal from all sides. So I ask you plainly, why should we trust a new Lord Stark? Why should we risk more umbers for your cause? Jon let out a slow breath. He could not fault the man's bitterness. Because the North needs to stand together, he answered, voice level. Not just against the memories of war, but against a threat beyond the wall, the White Walkers. This war of kings and lords is petty compared to what marches south. If we remain divided, we all die. The mention of White Walkers drew some mutters in the hall. Many had heard the old stories, but few truly believed. Jon raised his hands for quiet. I served at the wall for years. I've seen what's out there. The dead walk. They come for us all, and when the wall no longer holds them, the Umbers will be the first to face their wrath. Will you stand alone then, or join with Winterfell and the rest of the North to fight them? Silence stretched. The Umbers exchanged glances, skepticism warring with fear. Mors's gaze flicked to Sansa. Is that your claim too, girl? That ghouls and cold shadows are coming for us. Sansa's expression was solemn. My father always said winter was coming. I used to think it was just words. But Jon has seen the truth of it with his own eyes, and I trust him. We need you, my lord. Mors let out a breath through his nose, a soft snort. I'll not say I believe in ghosts without proof, but I've no love for the Boltons, that's certain. If you truly have them broken, that's something. You say you hold Ramsay in a dungeon. His lip curled with distaste. That filth deserves worse than a cell. He'll get worse, Jon said quietly. We intend to see him pay for his crimes. But we need your swords if the North is to stand. When the snows melt, if they melt, we might march again, or we might have to hold Winterfell against an even greater threat. Either way, House Stark wants House Umber at our side. Mors regarded them both for a long moment. Then he turned to a table where several large mugs of ale sat. He grabbed one and drained it in a single gulp, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and faced them again. Very well, he said gruffly. I'll not kneel here and now. I'm no court fop, but I'll pledge my men to your cause. Some of my kin may still be leery, but they'll follow me so long as we see results. We want a seat at the table when decisions are made for the North. And we want assurance you'll do whatever you can to free the great Jon from those accursed Freys. Jon felt a rush of cautious relief. We'll do our best on both counts. Thank you, Lord Umber. The big man corrected him with a grunt. Not a lord. I'm just Mors to most. The great Jon was our lord, and he's not dead yet. But for now, I lead our house. My men are at your disposal once we handle some housekeeping. He eyed Jon with a shrewd look. But if I find out you're leading us into a war of shadows while ignoring the living threat? Jon nodded. I won't ignore anything. We stand for the North. The vow seemed to satisfy Mors, for he extended a hand the size of a bear's paw, and Jon clasped it. The hall let out a ragged cheer, the tension lifting somewhat. Sansa exhaled softly, clearly relieved. The first step in forging a truly unified North had begun. That evening, the Umbers prepared a feast of sorts, harsh winter fare, mostly turnips and salted meat, but it was filling. Sansa managed a polite smile through the coarse jokes and rowdy toasts the Umbers favored. Jon drank sparingly, wanting to keep a clear head. A few of his men indulged more freely, swapping stories with their Umber counterparts. By night's end, a precarious alliance had formed. In the morning, they departed Last Hearth with a contingent of Umber riders. Jon was heartened by how quickly the Umbers had rallied once they decided to stand with House Stark. We never wanted to serve the flayed man, one burly soldier said to Sansa as they readied the horses. But it was that or lose our skins. Glad the Starks are back in force. Sansa's eyes gleamed with warmth. And we're glad for your allegiance. We'll not forget it. The next stop was Carhold, the seat of House Karstark. This promised to be more delicate, for the Karstarks had turned on Robb Stark after Lord Rickard Karstark was executed for murdering Lannister prisoners. That bitterness ran deep, Yet they, too, had no love for the Boltons, and rumor said their new lord, Haryon Karstark, had wavered, uncertain which way the tide would turn. Snow slowed the journey to a crawl. They had to skirt half-frozen rivers, cross bleak moors where howling winds battered them day and night. Ghost prowled ahead, sometimes vanishing into the white swirl, only to reappear silently at Jon's side. The deeper they traveled into the harsh wilderness, the more Jon felt the weight of time pressing upon them. Winter grew fiercer, the days shorter. He knew the White Walkers did not care about the alliances of mortal houses. If the North did not unite soon, it might be too late. Still, forging alliances by personal visits took time. He prayed that the others, Stannis, the Manderleys, the Glovers, were doing their part as well. Along the road, Sansa confided in him. "Do you think we'll ever see Arya, or Bran, or Rickon again?" Her tone was wistful, though fragile, as though she feared the answer. Jon pressed his lips together. "I don't know. I hope so. No one truly knows what became of them after Theon took Winterfell." He paused. "Sam, my friend in the Watch, once told me of rumors that Bran might still be alive, heading north of the Wall. But those are just rumors." Sansa let out a soft sigh, her eyes on the drifted snow. "I suppose we can only pray, then." Jon wished he could offer more comfort, but these days, prayers were all they had. They continued onward. When at last they came within sight of Carhold, a looming fortress of dark stone perched beside a frozen river, Jon felt a rush of apprehension. The Karstarks had always been close cousins to the Starks, descending from Carlin Stark, who founded their line centuries past. The very name reflected their shared blood. Yet the feud that arose from Lord Rickard's execution might not be easily mended. Still, a few Karstark outriders greeted them politely enough, though their faces were guarded. They led Jon, Sansa, and their men inside, where a small retinue of Karstark guards waited in the courtyard. The fortress was austere, the walls battered by winter storms. Jon's breath plumed before him as he dismounted. He spotted Haryon Karstark emerging from a door, flanked by stern-faced advisors. Haryon was a young man, perhaps younger than Jon by a year or two, with pale hair and a face lined by stress. He walked with a hint of a limp, the result of some old wound. Jon offered a cordial bow of his head. "Lord Karstark, I come in peace with my sister, Lady Sansa Stark. We seek to mend old wounds and unite the North." Haryon examined them both with cool eyes. "Jon Snow, they called you. Now Jon Stark. My father died by your brother Robb's own blade. You speak of old wounds. Those do not heal quickly." Sansa stepped forward, her voice calm, though sadness tinged it. "Lord Karstark, I'm sorry for the rift that opened between our houses. My brother Robb did what he felt was just, but it cost him dearly, and it cost the North dearly. Now we all pay the price." Haryon's jaw worked, as if he wrestled with conflicting emotions. "The Boltons forced me to bend the knee, but I never forgot that our lines sprang from the same blood. My father's pride led him to kill those prisoners and sealed our fate. Yet Robb's sentence robbed us of a father's guidance. The realm was in chaos." Jon met Haryon's gaze squarely. "I and your father's actions robbed Robb of vital alliances. We lost the war in part because of that. I'm not here to cast blame. I'm here to move forward. The White Walkers are real, Haryon. We need every sword. No one can stand alone." At that, Haryon's brow furrowed. "I've heard these tales. I want to believe our greatest danger is done with the Boltons' fall. But the snows deepen each day, and our harvests were meager. My people are hungry. If we march, we starve." "We're aware," Sansa said gently. "Winterfell is doing what it can to muster supplies. We've reopened trade routes to White Harbor. We have King Stannis' men bringing in provisions through the King's Road, whatever we can do to help. But we need your pledge, and we need it soon." Haryon's gaze flickered to the men behind Jon. Umbers, mountain clansmen, a handful of knights. He seemed to weigh the odds. "If I pledge to House Stark anew, can you guarantee us protection from any southern reprisal? The Lannisters still sit the throne, do they not?" Jon grimaced. "They do, but they're preoccupied with their own wars and a new queen from Dorne, or so rumor says. The Iron Throne's grip on the north has always been tenuous. If we stand together, there's little they can do from so far away. And Stannis Baratheon means to press his claim, so we may yet see a new order in the south in time. Haryon let out a slow breath that clouded the air. Then he spoke, voice resolute. The Karstarks will stand with the Starks again. If we truly face a winter worse than any in living memory, better to face it under our own banner. But understand, my men are half-starved, we have few supplies. If the dead truly march, we'll need help fortifying Karhold. Jon inclined his head. Agreed. We'll do what we can. Even if it means relocating some of your folk nearer to Winterfell, where the stores are greater. The point is, we'll support each other. That final phrase seemed to settle it. Haryon stepped forward and, in a gesture reminiscent of the old days, clasped Jon's forearm. Then let it be done. I, Haryon Karstark, pledge my house to House Stark. May we stand as kin once more, and may the old gods judge us fairly. Jon felt a wave of relief. Another major house brought into the fold. Another step closer to the united front they needed. Sansa offered a gentle smile. The Karstark guards watched with somber acceptance, as if they, too, recognized that the time for mourning the past had passed. That evening, Haryon hosted a small, modest feast for the Starks and their men. The fare was lean. Some salted pork, pickled vegetables, watery ale, but gratitude laced the small gathering. Sansa conversed quietly with some of the Karstark ladies, hearing their plights, offering empathy. Jon listened to Haryon's war stories, gleaning bits of intelligence about Bolton outriders still prowling the countryside. It was clear the damage wrought by the Red Wedding and the subsequent chaos had left scars that would not fade soon. Still, that night ended with a sense of solidarity. The Karstarks had come home at last. Jon might have lingered to ensure the alliance was fully secured, but the deepening cold urged them onward. Each day the nights grew longer, the wind more brutal. Reports trickled in of stray wights, glimpsed in remote northern reaches near the Bay of Seals. The Great War crept closer. Jon's entire reason for taking up the lordship was to unify the North before it was too late. So they left Karhold behind after only 2 nights, promising to send additional food and blacksmiths to help repair weapons. Sansa parted from Haryon politely, and they rode south and east, heading for the next stronghold, White Harbor, seat of House Manderley. The journey demanded they cross the rugged interior of the north, forging through snow-laden passes that tested even the hardy mountain clansmen among their group. Sansa bore the hardship with grim determination, but Jon could see how the cold sapped her strength. She had lived in southern climes for much of her captivity and was not used to traveling in northern winter's full fury. He tried to ensure she had the warmest furs, frequent rests, enough hot food to sustain her. She never once complained, though. He saw only a fierce will not to be a burden. Between Karhold and White Harbor, they encountered scattered survivors of small hamlets ravaged by outlaws or starved by poor harvests. Sansa insisted on giving them what supplies they could spare, though it was not much. The ragged thanks of the small folk reminded Jon how desperate the realm had become. If the White Walkers descended on them now, these people would have no defense at all. One afternoon, they rode past a frozen lake shimmering under the pale sun. In the distance, a column of black smoke marred the horizon. Jon set a few scouts ahead, suspecting a bandit raid or the remnants of a Bolton sally. The scouts returned with grim news. A hamlet burned, the people slaughtered, their bodies left in the snow. No sign of who might have done it. Jon felt ill at the thought that maybe it was not mere bandits but whites that had torn through, leaving carnage in their wake. He suppressed a shiver. He told Sansa they would press on. There was nothing to be done for the dead, save to say a prayer at the godswood if they found one. The memory of those horrors hovered in their minds as they traveled. The war for the North was not done, no matter how many houses bent the knee. At last, they neared the lands of House Manderley, more populous and better provisioned than much of the North. White Harbor glimmered in the distance, a beacon on the eastern coast. The White Knife River was frozen at its edges, though the current beneath still flowed. The city walls, tall and stout, were the mightiest in the north after Winterfell's. Here, merchants and fisherfolk bustled, though winter's bite had slowed trade. The sight of the port, its ships half-iced in harbor, reminded Jon of how precarious the realm's supply lines truly were. If White Harbor did not ally with him, the entire north might starve. When they approached the gates, banners fluttered from the turrets, the white merman of House Manderley on a field of turquoise. Jon's heart pounded. A successful alliance with the Manderleys would mean food, ships, and a secure foothold on the eastern coast. A failure might doom them to starve alone. The city guard halted their procession. After some tense introductions, the Manderley captain recognized the name Stark and, upon hearing Sansa was present, dispatched a runner to inform Lord Wyman Manderley if the old man was still in charge. Rumors said Wyman had feigned loyalty to the Boltons while secretly smuggling in support for the Starks. But in the Game of Thrones, rumors could deceive as easily as not. They were escorted through the city's streets, lined with snowdrifts and half-frozen slush. Curious onlookers peered from shuttered windows or braved the cold for a glimpse of the visitors. Some recognized the direwolf banners accompanying Jon's party, and hushed excitement followed in their wake. White Harbor might be more southern in style, but it had never fully forgotten that it was part of the north. At the gates of the new castle, the seat the Manderleys had raised after their initial arrival to this region centuries ago, they were met by a retinue of knights and ladies in warm attire. And there, seated in a wheeled chair covered in furs, was the Lord of White Harbor, Wyman Manderley himself. Massive of girth, with thick white hair and a jolly face that could shift from mirth to grim steel in an instant. Wyman greeted them with theatrical courtesy. "My dear Lord Stark, Lady Sansa, you do me the honor of visiting my humble White Harbor in this darkest winter. Welcome, welcome. Come inside. Warm yourselves by my hearth." His voice carried the genial lilt of a man who enjoyed feasts and company, but Jon had heard rumors that Wyman was far cannier than he appeared. Jon bowed. "Lord Manderley, we're glad to see you in good health. Winterfell stands under Stark rule again, and we come with hopes of uniting the North." Sansa curtsied gracefully, though she could not hide her exhaustion. "Lord Manderley, I've never forgotten your kindness to my family in days past. We have been scattered by war, but we hope White Harbor will stand with us to face the greater threats. My father always spoke fondly of your house." Wyman's eyes glimmered. "Ah, Ned Stark was a fine man. We share an ancient lineage, do we not? My forebears may have come from the south, but we have been loyal to the Starks for many centuries, and I suspect we may be loyal to them again." He paused, letting the suggestion hang in the air. "But come, I insist you join me at table. This cold is enough to freeze a man's marrow." He led them inside, his retinue trailing behind. The grand hall of the new castle was bright with tapestries of seas and merlings, the smell of fresh bread and roast fish, a pleasant change from the austere fare at Carhold and Last Hearth. Servants bustled about, presenting mulled wine. Jon took a cup gratefully, letting its warmth seep into his bones. Sansa did the same, offering the slightest of thankful smiles to the servant. Wyman settled in a chair at the head of a long table, beckoning them to sit near. Once they were settled, he waved a hand for the others to gather around as well. "So," said Wyman, his jowls trembling faintly, "tell me of Winterfell's recapture. We've heard only scraps. Some say Stannis the king overcame the Boltons. Others say a bastard Stark rose from the shadows like a dire wolf in the night. It's all quite dramatic." Jon glanced at Sansa, who nodded for him to speak. So Jon recounted the broad strokes. Stannis' arrival at the Wall, the offer of legitimization, the joint campaign to oust the Boltons, and the final assault on Winterfell. He spoke with measured calm, trying not to over-embellish. Wyman's eyes gleamed with interest. Sansa offered occasional interjections about the brutality of Bolton rule, her own captivity, and her escape. By the end, the hall was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Wyman exhaled heavily. "My dear Lady Sansa, you have suffered grievously at those fiends' hands. I prayed for your safe return when I learned of your plight. I am heartened you are here, unbroken." Sansa inclined her head graciously. "Your prayers mean more than you know." Wyman turned his gaze to Jon. "Your bold stroke, my lord, has given the North hope again. We Manderleys have long chafed at Bolton rule. They demanded heavy tribute from us, threatened our shipping. We feigned cooperation, but—" a dangerous glint touched his eye. "We are not so easily cowed. You may find that White Harbor is more prepared to support you than you imagine. But we must be practical. The Lannisters would see us crushed if we openly defy the Iron Throne. Our ships and trade routes are our lifeblood. We cannot risk them lightly." Jon leaned forward. "I understand, but the Lannisters have lost much of their power. They may hold the throne for now, but war consumes the South. They have no love for Stannis, but they also lack the strength to assert their will over the North, especially in winter. If you align with us now, you'll be forging the future of the North when spring comes, if it comes." Wyman's expression grew pensive. "There's also the matter of the White Walkers. You truly believe they march?" "I know they do," Jon said, voice taut. "I've seen them. Even now, reports of whites filter down from the northern mountains. We may not have long before they breach the wall or circumvent it, if such a thing is possible." At that, Wyman's face grew solemn. He glanced around at his bannermen. "We have heard tales, rumors from the sea, whispers among fishermen. Strange lights on the horizon, ice floes drifting farther south than ever before. I cannot dismiss it all as myth." "Very well, my lord. If you would have House Manderley stand with you, know that we do not do so lightly. We must see that you have a true plan, food enough for your armies, a strategy for dealing with the undead threat, and some manner of southern diplomacy in case the Lannisters sniff around. Show me that you can keep White Harbor from ruin, and we shall declare for House Stark openly and proudly." Jon and Sansa exchanged a look. She spoke gently. "We will do all we can, Lord Wyman. Winterfell and White Harbor have ever been the pillars of the North. If we stand together, no foe, living or dead, can easily break us." Wyman studied her, and a flicker of admiration crossed his features. "Spoken like a true daughter of Ned. Very well. In the days to come we'll talk details. And if all is agreeable, we shall proclaim for the wolf once more." He raised his cup. "To House Stark and the North." A hearty cheer rose. Jon felt a wave of relief. This was not a formal pledge yet, but Wyman was clearly leaning in their favor. That was enough to buoy Jon's spirits for now. They had gained the Umbers, the Karstarks, likely the Manderleys, and had Glover support from before. Half the North might soon unite under the Stark banner. Perhaps that was the best they could hope for in this harsh winter. Now, the question was, would it be enough when the dead came knocking? That night, Wyman insisted on hosting a lavish feast despite the constraints of winter. Fish and shellfish from the White Knife, boar roasted with apples, honeyed bread, courses marched forth in surprising abundance, drawing murmurs of envy from Jon's men who were accustomed to salt beef and turnips. The mermen of White Harbor might have put on a grand show to impress them. Sansa, though still subdued, managed to converse politely with Wyman's daughters and granddaughters, smiling at their tales of southern fashions and courtly romances. Jon found himself at the high table, fielding Wyman's questions about the Boltons, about King Stannis, about the intricacies of the White Walkers. He explained as best he could, urging Wyman to gather swords, spears, and to set his smiths to forging dragonglass-dipped weapons if any shipments of obsidian could be procured. Wyman listened, nodding gravely. By the end of the feast, it seemed White Harbor was all but committed. Finally, full of wine and exhausted from the day's negotiations, Jon excused himself. Sansa had already retired, and the hall was growing rowdy with late-night revelers. He climbed the stairs to the guest quarters, stepping carefully on the stone steps, ghost padding behind. His mind whirled with visions of armies, snowfall, and ice-eyed monsters. He pushed open the door to find Sansa in a chair by the hearth, still wearing her fine gown. She glanced up with a shadow of a smile. "You should rest," Jon said softly, closing the door behind him. She nodded, but her eyes drifted back to the flames. "I will. Needed a moment to myself. A pause. I see you're forging alliances faster than father ever had to. He always said the North was too large to unify easily, but you seem to be doing it. Jon stood beside her, letting Ghost settle near the fire. Father had peace for many years. He didn't have to unify every house to face an apocalypse. Desperation can be a powerful motivator. Her gaze flicked to him. It's not just desperation. They sense your resolve, Jon. You speak with conviction about the White Walkers, and they believe you. Father would be proud. That simple statement stirred emotions he couldn't name. He swallowed. Thank you. I only pray it's enough. They sat for a time in companionable silence. Finally, Jon stood to leave her to her rest. We'll likely depart for Winterfell in a day or two. We have what we came for, and traveling gets more dangerous with each passing day. Sansa rose too, drawing her cloak around her shoulders. Yes, and King Stannis should have returned by now. No doubt he'll want to see how our mission went. She hesitated, eyes searching Jon's face. I'm glad we did this together, Jon. I never thought I'd stand side by side with you like this. Not after everything that happened. He gave her a faint smile. Nor did I, but I'm grateful. We Starks need to stick together. She nodded, tears threatening to gather in her eyes again, though she blinked them away. Good night, Jon. Good night, Sansa. He gently squeezed her hand before slipping out. In the corridor, he exhaled, letting the tension seep from him. Each day felt like a fresh battle, not with swords but with memories, regrets, and precarious hopes. They were winning step by step, forging the alliances needed to stand against the long night. Yet a nagging dread gnawed at Jon's mind. Time was running out. He sensed it in the chill that seeped through even the thickest walls, in the haunted rumors from the far north. The White Walkers did not care about half-signed treaties or mortal politics. Sooner or later, the storm would break. They lingered a day longer, enough to see Wyman Manderly present them with a formal letter endorsing House Stark as the rightful rulers of the North. His vow to send men and supplies was made, though he requested the official confirmation be sealed when Stannis next visited. Jon agreed. Any friction with the Baratheon king would have to be navigated carefully, but Wyman seemed confident he could placate Stannis with naval support or coin. The important thing was that White Harbor would stand with Winterfell. It was a triumph that might well tip the balance. Then, at dawn on the second day, Jon and Sansa set out for home, eager to complete the circle of alliances. They planned to pass through several smaller holdings on the way, gathering final pledges. The roads were growing worse by the day, the cold more bitter, the terrain more perilous. But their spirits were high with the knowledge that half the North now rallied behind them. They made their way slowly, losing horses to frostbite and men to sudden sickness. Sansa bore it with a stoic will that Jon admired. He tried to keep her warm, offering his own cloak when she shivered. She refused it, pointing out he needed it as well. Each night they camped. The wind howled around them like direwolves from a distant age. At last, after many days of grueling travel, Winterfell's familiar walls appeared through the haze of drifting snow. The sight stirred an unexpected wave of relief in Jon's chest. Felt more like home than it ever had before. Sansa, too, let out a soft exhalation, as though her entire body relaxed at the sight of the towers and ramparts. The gate opened to admit them, and inside they found the courtyard much busier than when they'd left. Soldiers bearing the Stag and Flaming Heart banner mingled with fresh arrivals from the mountain clans and new lords who must have come to present themselves. Word spread fast. The Starks had returned, at last, from their journey. Jon swung down from his horse, stiff with cold and fatigue. At once, a steward rushed to take the reins. Another offered a fur-lined cloak for Sansa. Jon could see columns of smoke rising from the chimneys, signifying life and warmth within. The murmur of activity echoed from the great hall. Then he noticed a figure striding purposefully across the courtyard. Stannis Baratheon, clad in a thick cloak of black wool, the flaming heart on his breastplate. His face was dour as ever, but there was a certain intensity in his gaze. With him was Melisandre, her red robes striking against the snow. Davos hovered near, looking relieved to see Jon and Sansa return. Stannis halted before Jon, looking him over. "Lord Stark, you took longer than expected." Jon forced a level tone. "The roads were worse than we thought, but we've returned with pledges from House Umber, House Karstark, and House Manderley. The North unites." Stannis gave a curt nod, though a flicker of satisfaction crossed his stern features. "Good. We'll have need of them. Ramsay Bolton has been dealt with in your absence." Jon's eyes narrowed. "Dealt with? How?" Stannis's mouth pressed into a thin line. "He was tried for his crimes, publicly, as was just. The man was beyond redemption. We executed him here in the courtyard. Perhaps I should have waited for you, but time was short." A flurry of emotions washed over Jon. Regret that he had not been there to witness the end of that monster. Relief that Ramsay no longer breathed. He glanced at Sansa. Her face was still, but he saw tears gathering in her eyes. She blinked them away, inhaling shakily, but said nothing. She'd wanted to see justice done. Now it was already past. Davos cleared his throat gently, sparing them from an awkward silence. "Welcome home, my lady. We're pleased to see you safe." The king has been busy ensuring the loyalty of the local houses, but many more have come seeking to swear fealty in person to House Stark. They wait in the Great Hall. Sansa rallied herself, clasping her hands before her. "Then let us not keep them waiting. We'll greet them at once." Jon nodded, steadying himself. "Yes, we'll address them together. If you'll excuse us, Your Grace." He gave Stannis a respectful nod, which the king returned. Melisandre watched them with her usual enigmatic half-smile. "By all means," Stannis said. "We'll speak again soon." Jon and Sansa headed toward the hall. Behind them, the courtyard hummed with the new life that had come to Winterfell. Jon felt a stirring of optimism, though overshadowed by the knowledge that Ramsay's death was but one more thread severed in a tapestry of war. Still, the Boltons were truly gone now, their shadow lifted. And with the major houses pledged or pledging, the North was as united as it had been in decades. If any hope remained against the White Walkers, it lay here, in the seat of the Starks, with the alliances they had forged by the sweat of their brow and the risk of their lives. They stepped into the great hall to find it bustling with lords, knights, and clan chiefs, huddling around braziers or talking in low tones. At once, a hush fell as they noticed Jon and Sansa. The flickering torchlight illuminated the battered Stark banners hanging from the rafters, the table where petitions were heard, and the battered high seat. Sansa squeezed Jon's arm once, a silent show of solidarity, and together they walked forward. He saw respect in the eyes of those who turned to face them. Some might still question how a once bastard now claimed the name Stark, but the presence of Sansa eased many of those doubts. They ascended the dais, and Sansa took a seat at his side. Jon looked across the hall, seeing men he recognized. Some were Glovers, some Umbers, some whose sigils he could not recall, but who must have come seeking a place in the new order. Bowls of hot stew and flagons of mead cluttered tables near the front, indicating they had been waiting a while. The hush deepened as Jon cleared his throat. "I stand before you, Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North," he began, his voice carrying through the hall. "My sister, Lady Sansa Stark, is here with me. We have traveled through bitter roads to unite the North, for winter is upon us, and a darkness beyond the wall gathers strength." A rustling moved through the crowd. Some nodded. Others seemed uneasy at the mention of the darkness. Sansa's voice was quiet but clear. "We thank you all for coming. I know times are lean. Many have lost kin in the wars, but House Stark has returned to stand as the shield of the North. We cannot do it alone. We need your swords, your hearts, and your faith." Murmurs of approval drifted up. One older knight with the sigil of House Flint stepped forward. "My lord, my lady, House Flint pledges its loyalty. We've heard the tales of your campaign, how you ended Bolton rule. That alone deserves our thanks." A smattering of applause followed. Another man rose, bearing the insignia of House Serwyn. We, too, pledge ourselves to House Stark. The Cerwyns have never forgotten the debt we owe to Ned Stark, who was a just liege lord. One by one, lords and envoys came forward to declare their fealty. Jon and Sansa listened intently, exchanging soft words with each. Some asked for assistance with supplies or demanded a place in the councils that would decide the North's future. Others simply expressed relief that the Boltons were gone. By the time the final man had spoken, the hall felt charged with a cautious enthusiasm, an undercurrent of unity that the North had not seen in years. Jon stood. "We thank you for your loyalty. The North stands together once more. But I must warn you, the true enemy lies beyond the wall. The White Walkers are real. Soon, we will be called to defend our homes against an army of the dead." His gaze swept across the assembled. "I ask each of you to prepare your men, train them, gather dragonglass if you can find it, or keep your eyes open for shipments from Dragonstone if the king can secure them. Fortify your walls. Spread the word to your vassals. The night is dark, and it grows darker by the day." Some seemed skeptical, but most recognized the gravity in his tone. Sansa rose as well, lending her presence to reinforce Jon's words. "We will not abandon you," she said. "Winterfell stands as a beacon in this storm. Our father taught us to protect those who cannot protect themselves. That is what we mean to do." A murmur of agreement spread. Jon could almost feel the old gods stirring in the weirwood outside, as though they bore witness to this moment. The lords bowed, and the business concluded. Slowly, they began to file out, speaking in hushed voices. Jon let out a breath, tension coiled in his shoulders. Sansa placed a reassuring hand on his arm. He looked at her, and despite the tiredness in her eyes, she offered a genuine smile. "You did well," she said. He returned a faint grin. "So did you. Together, then." "Always," she said quietly. They left the dais, descending into the swirl of departing guests and knights. Stannis appeared at the edge, brow knit as though half impressed, half perturbed that the northern lords responded more to Jon and Sansa than to him. Jon inclined his head to the king, who stepped closer. "I see your journey was fruitful," Stannis said, voice low. "You've drawn the North under your banner, so it seems." Jon dipped his head in acknowledgement. "Many have pledged, enough to form a formidable host if the time comes to march or defend. With your aid, we might hold them together." Stannis's eyes flickered. "Then we must prepare. My scouts bring grim tidings from the far north. Isolated pockets of whites, rumors of entire villages gone silent. The night's watch is short on numbers, beset with wildlings still settling along the gift. We may need to intervene personally, or the walkers might simply sweep past the wall if it falls." Those words chilled Jon's blood more than the winter wind. If the watch was failing, the realm might have weeks or days before the dead poured in. "Then we gather our forces," Jon said firmly. "We have to face them at the wall if possible. Once they cross, it's too late for many. But we'll need time. And men." Sansa stepped forward. "We'll help however we can. Winterfell's men stand ready. But crossing the north in winter is not a trivial undertaking. We might lose half our number just getting to the wall." Stannis nodded. "So it's said. And yet, do we have any choice? If we wait until spring, the dead will not." He exhaled, expression set. "We shall consider the best approach. Gather your banners, Lord Stark. Pray the old gods or Lawler or the Seven watch over us. For we march into darkness one way or another." He strode off, Melisandre at his side. Davos lingered only to give Jon a solemn nod of greeting before following after the king. Jon stood with Sansa amid the departing lords, the crackle of torches the only sound in the growing hush. Ghost approached, pressing his nose into Jon's hand. Jon stroked the direwolf's thick fur, seeking some calm in the midst of fear. Sansa turned to him, her expression pensive. "We've done what we can. The North stands behind us. But the White Walkers, the king might be right. If we're forced to march north, thousands could die just from the cold and hunger." Jon remembered the sight of Hardhome and the horrors he had only heard about from the few wildlings who escaped. We can't fight them on an open field. We need the wall. The question is, do we have enough time to move our armies there before it's overrun? She set a hand on his shoulder. We can only do our best, Jon. We've done everything possible so far. He nodded, swallowing back a surge of anxiety. Let's hope it's enough. That night, as the wind howled over Winterfell's battlements, Jon and Sansa joined a war council with Stannis, Davos, Lady Glover, representatives from the newly pledged houses, and the mountain clans. Maps of the north lay spread across a great oaken table. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on drawn faces. They debated the feasibility of marching an army north to relieve the wall, weighed the risk of leaving the southern passes undefended should the Lannisters or other foes try to take advantage of the chaos. The question of leadership arose. Who would command the combined forces? Some northern lords looked to Jon as Warden of the North. Others insisted the king lead any major campaign. Stannis, stiff-backed, declared that he would not shirk from facing the enemy himself, but he recognized that the Northmen might heed a Stark's voice more readily than his. A compromise took shape. They would march in tandem, with Jon leading the northern contingents, Stannis leading his royal host. A joint command, precarious though it might be. Davos tried to mediate, ensuring each side felt respected. Sansa watched quietly, her presence a reminder of the Stark name's authority. By the time the council ended, the plans were still rough. The first step was to send word to the Night's Watch that help was coming, to gather as many supplies as possible, and to decide on the best route north. The King's Road might be the most direct, but was it passable in such heavy snow? Perhaps not. The clans might guide them through mountainous paths, but that could be equally perilous. In the end, the council concluded they would attempt to blaze a route along the King's Road, using all available manpower to clear drifts and maintain supply wagons. A portion of the host might remain at Winterfell as a rearguard, protecting the newly unified North from any internal or external threats. Jon left the council drained, longing for the simple life of a Night's Watch ranger. The thought made him laugh bitterly. The Watch's life was anything but simple these days. The realm tottered on the brink of extinction. He found Sansa at the corridor's end, lost in thought, and joined her. Together they walked to the Godswood. Snow drifted in thick flakes, clinging to the bare branches of the weirwoods and the statues. The heart tree's carved face looked on with timeless sorrow. The hot springs that fed the castle sent up faint wisps of steam, leaving patches of green grass near them even in the dead of winter. Sansa knelt by the weirwood's trunk, resting a hand on the carved face. Her breath trembled in the cold night air. Jon stood behind her, quiet, letting her have the moment. Eventually, she spoke without turning. Father prayed here, Mother as well. The old gods always seemed distant to me when I was younger, but now I feel them everywhere, as if they're listening. Jon stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. I feel it too. Maybe it's only comfort we seek, but maybe they truly watch over us. She swallowed. We've done so much to bring the North together, to prepare for this war, but I'm still so afraid, Jon. Afraid that this unstoppable darkness will devour everything, that we'll be too late, or that the living will tear each other apart before the dead even arrive. Her voice cracked. I want to believe we'll live to see spring, see peace return, but I've lost so much hope before. He squeezed her shoulder gently. We might fail, or we might win. I don't know, but we have to try, Sansa. We owe it to Father, to Robb, to all our people. The Starks have guarded the North for thousands of years. We can't turn away now. She looked up at him, eyes shining with tears in the moonlight. Then we stand together. Winterfell is ours. The North is uniting, and we'll face this threat, living or dead, side by side. He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He found himself thinking of Arya, Bran, Rickon, and even his mother, whoever she might have been. How many ghosts walked these halls now? Could they see that two battered children of Ned Stark had come to shoulder the burdens left behind? If so, Jon prayed they would guide him, for the path was darker than any he had known. A thin wind stirred the branches overhead, making the red leaves rustle like soft whispers. Perhaps it was only the breeze, or perhaps the old gods murmured their approval. Jon took Sansa's hand, and together they remained in the godswood for a time, letting the hush of the ancient place surround them. When they finally returned to the castle's halls, the watchmen on the walls noted their passing with nods of respect. The corridors were quieter at this late hour, but a sense of renewed purpose filled Winterfell. The keep was no longer the seat of a single house ravaged by war. It was a fortress preparing for the battle that would decide the fate of the North, and perhaps all of Westeros. Inside the library tower, scribes prepared ravens with final instructions. In the courtyard, blacksmiths toiled at forging or mending arms. Even in the great hall, a handful of lords conferred in hushed tones, planning provisions and routes. The hour was late, but the war would not wait. Jon and Sansa parted ways to seek a few hours of rest before dawn. In his chamber, Jon found Ghost curled by the hearth, the direwolf's vigilant eyes snapping open as Jon entered. Jon scratched Ghost's ears absently, stifling a weary yawn. Despite his exhaustion, sleep would not come easily. His mind raced with all that lay ahead. The march north, the uncertain alliance with Stannis, the fragile tapestry of houses woven into unity. And beyond all that, an army of ice and death, relentless and unfeeling. He stared into the embers, recalling the oath he had once taken for the Night's Watch, to be the shield that guards the realms of men. He had broken that vow in form, but in spirit perhaps he still served it. Whether named Snow or Stark, bastard or lord, his purpose had not changed. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire lull him. At length, sleep took him, filled with uneasy dreams of icy tundras and pale shadows, of direwolves howling at a frozen moon. Morning arrived with a crisp, cloudless sky, the sun a pale disk offering little warmth. Outside, the war horn sounded, and the final preparations began. Men bustled in the courtyard, wagons loaded with supplies. Ravens soared from the rookery, carrying word to each allied house that the time to gather at Winterfell was near. Within days, thousands would converge upon these walls, ready to march or to stand. The newly minted alliances would be tested. The great gamble would begin. Sansa oversaw the logistics, assisted by Lady Glover, ensuring the accommodations in the winter town could handle the influx. Stannis's officers worked alongside them, coordinating the knights who would join the northern armies. Davos roamed between them, bridging any disputes with quiet diplomacy. Melisandre lingered like a living flame, murmuring of prophecies and Azor a high reborn. Jon avoided her more than he once had, unsettled by her cryptic nature. He had enough burdens without unraveling riddles of light and shadow. By midday, fresh riders had begun to arrive. Karstark outriders, banners of House Serwyn, scattered groups from smaller houses answering the call. Some glared uneasily at Stannis' royal men, but the presence of the direwolf banners overhead soothed them. Jon moved among them, greeting each arrival, directing them to their quarters. He felt strangely at home in the bustle, once again reminded of the times Robb had gathered bannermen in the early days of the War of the Five Kings. But those days ended in betrayal and blood. He prayed these would not follow suit. As evening neared, a hush settled over Winterfell like a drawn breath before the plunge. The courtyard was packed with men and horses, tents erected for overflow lodging. Fires crackled, warding off the worst of the cold. Jon and Sansa stood on the steps leading into the great hall, side by side, gazing out at the throng. Ghost sat at Jon's feet, ever watchful. Jon felt the weight of their collective trust pressing on him. He turned to Sansa. She wore a thick white fur cloak that set off her hair, her posture poised yet tense. "Are we ready?" she asked quietly. Jon's eyes surveyed the mass of allies. "As ready as we can be. More will arrive in the coming days. Then we march." He swallowed. "Or we plan a defense, depending on what news comes from the wall." Sansa nodded. For a moment, she clutched his arm, a gesture of reassurance. "We'll face it together," she repeated, echoing the vow they'd shared beneath the weirwood. He let out a breath. Yes, for the North, for the realm. They descended the steps to speak with some of the newly arrived lords, the setting sun painting the sky in streaks of purple and orange. The cold wind stirred the banners overhead, the dire wolf of Stark snapping in the breeze beside the stag and flaming heart of Stannis. Men busied themselves, fires glowed, and amid the flurry of activity, a sense of grim determination reigned. House Stark was back, guiding the North as it had for generations, and at their side stood a king from the south, two battered armies forging a single purpose. In the days that followed, the host at Winterfell swelled. House Manderly's levies arrived by the hundred, bringing wagons of preserved fish and fresh bread. The Umbers, the Karstarks, and smaller houses like the Flints, Serwyns, and Tallhearts assembled. Even a fraction of the mountain clans from beyond the usual sphere of influence trickled in, drawn by rumors that the Starks readied to fight an unimaginable foe. Tents sprouted around Winterfell like mushrooms after a rain. Morale was guardedly high. The men seemed relieved to unite under the ancient banner. Some even spoke hopefully of forging a new kingdom in the north after the threat was ended. Jon said nothing to encourage such talk, one war at a time. The White Walkers came first. Sansa took to organizing everything from supply wagons to distribution of warm clothing. Jon found himself marveling at her. Gone was the naive girl who once dreamed of being a southern lady. In her place was a woman of quiet competence, who had learned harsh lessons in adversity. She never shirked a task or shrank from a difficulty. She listened to the counsel of older ladies like Lady Glover, but she also made decisions on her own, sometimes surprising the men. Over time, they came to respect her. Some, indeed, whispered that Lady Sansa was the truest embodiment of Catelyn Stark's spirit. Meanwhile, Stannis and Jon coordinated the martial side of things with the Northern Lords. The plan took shape. Within a fortnight, once the last of the Karstark and Manderly contingents arrived, they would attempt to march north in stages, establishing secure waypoints. Garrisons would remain in certain strategic towers. Supply trains would need to be guarded carefully, for a single lost wagon could mean starvation for hundreds. Davos cautioned that no plan survived contact with the enemy. Melisandre insisted that Lawler would guide them, that the flames had shown her glimpses of victory in ice and fire. Jon listened but trusted more in steel and unity than in prophecy. Finally, the day came when the horns sounded in the crisp dawn air. A meeting of lords was called for final orders. Jon rose from his bed, donned warm leathers and a cloak pinned with the direwolf sigil. He strapped Longclaw to his side. Ghost trailed behind him, silent as a wraith. In the courtyard, the sun had barely cleared the eastern walls, casting pale light on the gathered hosts. The sight of so many banners fluttering in the cold wind seized Jon's breath. Manderly's merman, Glover's gauntlet, Serwyn's battle-axe, Karstark's sunburst, Umber's roaring giant, and many more. And above them all, the direwolf of House Stark. Next to it, Stannis' standard of the crowned stag in flames. It was a stirring vision, one that felt half a legend and half a desperate gambit. Sansa stood on the steps, half watching the swirl of men. She spotted Jon and beckoned him over. They're all waiting. Stannis wants to address them first. Jon nodded. Let's not keep them. Together, they climbed a small wooden platform erected for this gathering. Stannis, clad in black armor, stood at the center, Davos to his right. Melisandre lingered behind, her red hair vivid against the snow. As the horns silenced, the crowd of northern lords, knights, and clansmen turned their attention to the platform. Stannis spoke, voice cold and commanding. He called them to stand united, to remember that the realm's true threat was not in King's Landing or the Iron Islands, but in the far north. He praised their courage in bending the knee to House Stark, in forging this alliance under the banner of a king who cared for the realm. Then he gestured to Jon and Sansa. These are the blood of Ned Stark, the Warden of the North and his lady sister. Heed their counsel. Fight beside them, for winter is here, and if we do not win this war, none of us shall see another spring. Jon took a deep breath and stepped forward. He let his eyes sweep over the multitude. "Men and women of the North," he began. "You know me as Jon Stark, once Jon Snow. You have fought for Winterfell, bled for our houses, and endured the treachery of the Boltons. Now we face a foe that does not bargain or bleed. I have seen these creatures. They are death incarnate. But we do not stand alone. We stand together, united. That is our strength. So let every man sharpen his steel, every smith forge what he can. Let every heart be steeled with courage. We march not for glory, but for survival. And if we hold true to each other, if we hold to the bonds that make us the North, we may yet see the dawn." He paused, uncertain how to end. Then he simply said, "Winter is here. Let us meet it as one." A rumble of voices rose, echoing off the castle walls. Some shouted their house words, others brandished spears. Sansa glanced at Jon, her eyes shining with pride and apprehension. For a moment, hope flared bright, a spark in the deep cold. Then the horns sounded once more, signifying the mustering. The banners stirred, and the crowd broke into pockets of activity. Stannis nodded curtly at Jon. "Well said. Let us hope it stirs their blood enough." "We'll need more than stirring words," Jon replied. "True enough," Stannis said, turning away to confer with Davos about the logistics of the march. Jon exhaled, stepping down from the platform. Sansa joined him, hooking her arm in his. "They'll follow you," she whispered. "You spoke from the heart. That's what they need." He gave her a tight smile. "Let's just hope it's enough when the time comes." She nodded. "We'll make it enough. We have no other choice." As the day wore on, the swirl of final preparations consumed every corner of Winterfell. Blacksmiths hammered steel. Masons finished reinforcing the outer gates. Scribes double-checked supply manifests. Lords from all corners of the North haggled over who would march first, who would guard the baggage train, how many men to leave behind. Jon, Sansa, and Davos spent hours adjudicating disputes. Stannis prowled about, insisting that any squabbles be settled swiftly. The winter sun arced low across the sky, setting mid-afternoon in a wash of pale red and gold. By dusk, the courtyard was a sea of flickering torches. Jon stood at the battlements, Ghost by his side, looking out over the camp below. Tents stretched far beyond the castle walls, a testament to the largest gathering of northern might since Robb was proclaimed king in the north. The memory of Robb's defeat stung. This time, there would be no illusions of southern conquest. Their war was for survival alone. He listened to the wind moan, recalling the old words, "The night is dark and full of terrors." Yet the North had never been more united in purpose, all thanks to the name he once thought he could never bear. A soft step announced Sansa's arrival. She joined him, pulling her cloak tight against the cold. "This is more than I ever imagined," she murmured, gazing at the flickering lights. "It feels like we're on the brink of something, like the cusp of a legend." Jon nodded. "We are, one way or another." He let silence reign for a time. Then he turned to her, voice low. "Thank you for coming home, Sansa. None of this would have been possible without you." They needed a trueborn Stark to believe in, not just a bastard with a king's decree. She shook her head. "They needed both of us. We complement each other in ways neither of us expected. I'm glad we found each other again." He looked at her, feeling the strange mix of affection, responsibility, and kinship that bound them. "Me too," he said quietly. They stood there, side by side, watching as the lights below slowly dimmed and men hunkered down for the night. Tomorrow or the next day, the march would begin in earnest. The Great War crept closer, like a vast shadow stretching over the land. Yet in this moment, on the walls of Winterfell, with the swirling snow glittering in torchlight, Jon felt a spark of hope. They had done what once seemed impossible. Reunited the North, ended Bolton tyranny, rallied once scattered houses under a single banner. If the old gods or any gods yet listened, maybe they would not forsake these last efforts of mortal men. Far to the north, beyond the scope of any mortal sight, the White Walkers stirred in the endless night, their army of dead swelling with each fallen village. They came with the chill of ancient prophecy, unstoppable, unyielding. But the living were not defenseless, not anymore. The battered North, under the direwolf banner, steeled itself for the storm. And at the heart of that banner stood Jon Snow, reborn as Jon Stark, and Sansa Stark, a sister returned from nightmares. They carried the legacy of Ned and Robb, of Bran and Arya and Rickon, of all the Starks lost to treachery and war. Winter had come, but in Winterfell's halls, the fires still burned, defiant against the night. The real war lay ahead, uncertain and terrifying. Yet for the first time in what felt like centuries, House Stark stood united. The North rallied to its cause, and the realm's last hope might be found in that unity. And so Jon and Sansa remained on the battlements, gazing into the darkness, determined to face the long night together. For they were Starks, and winter was their birthright to endure or perish. Together they would fight for the dawn.